And I just realized how much I miss you. I feel like, remember Miss Artist from Romper Room, she would say, I'm seeing Barbara Esring, and I'm seeing Barbara Levin, and I'm seeing all of these, Harriet Merkowitz, and all of these people out there. And it's really great seeing all of you. But you're not going to see me anymore because I'm going to go to my PowerPoint in a minute. So if whoever the technician person is, I'm going to do a share screen. And just a second here. All right, can you see that? No?
No, we still can't see it.
Okay. How about that?
No. Nothing yet, Lisa.
Wait a minute, it's loading. Sorry. Do I hit send here? Is that what I do?
No, you're going to share your screen.
Yeah, I did that. I hit share screen.
Share screen and then choose your PowerPoint.
Well, my PowerPoint is up there.
Okay, so in the box, you have a box there, and then one of the options is actually your PowerPoint, and you're going to click on that.
Well, I'm seeing my PowerPoint on my screen right now.
Correct. So in the bottom, did you click share screen on the bottom of Zoom?
I did. Let me get back in there again. Let's see here. I'm watching somebody on YouTube here. Sorry about this. I do not understand why this is not going to my share screen here.
Okay, so let's pause the recording.
I'm going to get rid of this stuff at the top. Let's see here. Here we go. Okay, are you with me?
Yes, we are.
Great. Okay, I'm going to have to minimize all of this. Okay. So the first thing I want to say, and this is probably something that a number of you are already very, very well familiar with, and that is, when you think, and there are probably a few of you out there that can go back 50 years in Women's League. And remember what the conferences and the conventions were like in those days. There were, most of the people who were brought in were men who came in to speak, who came in to do everything. And, you didn't have a lot of Lynn Hellers around who could, give a Devar Torah the way she did in those days. But pretty much all programming was, at that point, was still relegated to men. And one of the great contributions to Women's League is now that has this great a cadre of women who have tremendous facility in being able to teach about many, many things. And we now are almost completely reliant on women to do everything that we do today. And this is something that we really should congratulate ourselves about. And this is a sign of the times and real progress in the history of women. which brings me to my next point, and that is about women's history. And basically what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to do a brief, very brief run through of the history of women, Jewish women's participation in Tikkun Olam in the United States, in North America. And I have to say that until relatively recently, and I'm really talking about the last 30 or 40 years, even a presentation like this would have been impossible, because the story of women and women in the narrative, women part in the historical narrative prior to about 1970 was almost nil. And I am not understating this enough. When you look at textbooks from the old days, and I'm talking about the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were scant mention of any women anywhere in these written histories of the Jews throughout the world. And it's only because of Jewish feminism and the rise of social history and feminist history that we've been able to recover the voices and the activities and the immense roles and participation that women made through all periods of history. And this is a very, very modern phenomenon. And in fact, Gerda Lerner was probably one of the first women to study, one of the first women, female historians, to study the role of women in history and to bring into the narrative what women were doing. And as you can see here, this very first quote of what she talks about, how she had observed the stories of humanity. And she said here at the very beginning, everything that explains the world has in fact explained a world that does not exist, a world in which men are at the center of the human enterprise and women are at the margins, helping them. Such a world does not exist, never has. And so what we have here is the story of how Jewish women were really at the center of all kinds of Tikkun Olam activities in the United States, but only recently, because of the work of historians like Shuli Rubin Schwartz and Paula Hyman and some of the, Deborah Lipstadt and some of the first generation of female Jewish historians, historians of feminism, are we able to recover some of these amazing stories. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start in the early period, and I just want to make a couple points to you all about demographics. The numbers of Jews in the United States, of course, as you know, started out very small. There were 23 who arrived in a boat in 1654. By the time of the American Revolution, there were barely 2,500 Jews in all of the colonies. And throughout the early part of the 19th century, a gradual accretion of Jews coming in, generally from Central Europe, from the German city-states, Western Europe. And up until about 1870, there were less than 500,000 Jews in the United States. And so you have to put this in perspective in terms of numbers. And of those, especially the German Jews who came, there weren't necessarily a lot of women. A lot of the first wave of German Jews who came through were men. But then, as you know, with the pogroms and the horrible impoverishment and the population explosion of Jews in Eastern Europe, 1881, and with the assassination of Tsar Alexander and the pogroms broke out, the floodgates broke and huge numbers of Jews came to the United States after 1881. And between the years 1881 and 1924, when immigration was closed, 2.5 million Jews came to the United States. So you can see how the demographic shift changed from the first Sephardic wave to the middle German Jewish wave to, by and large, the huge numbers of Jews who came from Eastern Europe. And so that very first generation of Jews who came, the first few generations, those around and just after the American Revolution, were small numbers of women who generally came from very wealthy families, and still they still had lived out that ethos of women's principal role is to be at home, to tend hearth and family and children. But there were actually a few of the women who broke that mold and who began to sort of create new paths for women, and from which they could extend their roles in hearth into public life. And now there's, as you can see here, the first woman that I want to look at today, certainly someone that you all know very well, Rebecca Gratz. She was actually one of the few Jewish women that historians were talking about in mid-century. She came from a very wealthy family in Philadelphia. She never married. This was not uncommon, especially women who found themselves working in the public domain, who really focused all of their energies on taking care of the people outside of their homes, because they didn't have families, husbands, and children to take care of. But Rebecca Gratz, saw what was, the paucity of all kinds of resources available to Jews living in Philadelphia. And she was a real, she was an organizer par excellence. And she founded, along with a few of her friends, initially not both Jewish and non-Jewish, founded the Female Association for the Relief of Women in Reduced Circumstances. That's what it was called. She remained organization for 20 years. And here's a little interesting point, and that is she remained unmarried, even though she had had a number of suitors. She was, as you can see, she was very beautiful. In fact, she was purported to be the Rebecca of Ivanhoe, but that's a side issue. But she remained unmarried, and one of the reasons was very practical, and that was that if she were a married woman and she were controlling the finances of these organizations, her husband would be able to co-opt any of those finances, and she would not be able to retain control over them, because married women in the 19th century, were not in control of their own money, and any money they brought into their marriage, or any money that they might have made through any possible work while they were married, was completely co-opted by their husbands, and they had no control over it. So it suggested that she could maintain the funds and control the funds that they took in. Another thing that Rebecca Gratz did, she actually helped to develop a number of very important institutions in Philadelphia, the Hebrew Free Loan Society, but also she founded the first Hebrew Sunday school in the United States. And this was very important because the Jewish children, up until this point, the only opportunities they had for learning anything was at home. And of course, as you know, there's a lot of gender seclusion at this point. So this was open to both girls and boys. Initially they had to use Christian study texts, Bible study texts, and Rebecca realized quickly the agenda of these Christian study texts, and she took it upon herself to develop a Sunday school reading Sunday school texts for children. And as you can see here in the Constitution of the Female Hebrew Benevolent Society, of which she was also a founding member, she says here, in all communities, the means of alleviating the sufferings of the poor are considered of high importance by the benevolent in the humane. So she has already brought into that world the ethics that she and the values that she had learned from the Bible. And this was true of a lot of women who might have had very nominal, marginal connections to Judaism, but they had all in the values and the ethics of the Hebrew Bible and Hebrew literature was infused in them in their daily lives. And we will see throughout all of the activities of these women that these ethics that came from the Bible were very much part and parcel of what they did and why they did it. Another woman prior to or just after the Revolution and prior to the Civil War came from the South. Her name was Pnina Moy. She was a poet and she was a hymnist, and she actually wrote a number of Hebrew poems, poems in English that could be read in the synagogues, but also she translated and wrote a number of hymns that were used in the hymnal of her congregation, Beth Elohim, in South Carolina, in Charleston, South Carolina. As you can see here on the hymnal, however, she was not credited with writing these hymns because, God forbid, we should be singing hymns that were written by women. Nevertheless, everyone knew of Pnina's talents. She was well read. She had written a book that was one of the first published book that came out, written by a woman. It had a very unusual name, and it was called her Fancy Book. And in it, she had all kinds of mices and stories. And she, this fancy sketchbook, as I said, it was the first published book in the United States by a Jewish American woman that was read by women. And she was a social commentator and very well known throughout the colony at that point, then the state of South Carolina. We're going to move forward now into mid-century, where we're going to see a rise of these German Jewish women who came from middle class or upper middle class families, who decided that they were going to extend their talents beyond their homes, and they went again out into the public domain, which prior to that point, women had been not prohibited from, but certainly were not encouraged to participate in any activities outside of the home. And as you can see, again, I have highlighted here a number of passages from the Bible, again, that infused them, that it influenced their attitude about how you treat strangers in your midst, how you take care of the weak and the fatherless, the afflicted and the destitute. And again, as you know, this famous statement that on three things that the world stands on: Torah, on avodah, on service, and on acts of loving kindness, gemilut chasadim. And these again were Jewish values that had long been infused in the daily lives of these women that they were now able to develop outside of the home. Of course, you know this, Emma Lazarus, who was a poet, an American poet, very strong Jewish identity that she developed. Actually, she came from a Sephardic family, partially Sephardic. It was an intermarriage, partially Sephardic, partially Ashkenazic, partially German. And she had a sort of a limited Jewish, at least public Jewish identity. But when she heard about the pogroms that had broken out in the 1880s in Eastern Europe, this kindled her Jewish identity, and she became much more articulate and became a proponent of Zionism. But she also was very much a proponent of how Jews should advocate, as Jewish Americans should advocate, kindness to strangers who came into the United States, to treat them with kindness and with dignity. She wrote this poem, of course, which you know the last lines of. It's interesting, she didn't write it for the purpose of the Statue of Liberty. After she died at a very young age. And after she died, this poem was rediscovered and it was engraved on the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty, in which she says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." And in this, again, she is reflecting the values of the Bible about being kind to strangers, which is reiterated over and over again throughout many books of the Bible. You should be kind to the strangers, because remember that once upon a time we were strangers in a strange land. The next, Julia Richman, who also came, again, another one of these women who came from a wealthy German Jewish family. She never married, and she didn't aspire to marriage, because a lot of women who became teachers, who became nurses, realized that first and foremost their focus was going to have to be on their students, on their patients, and they couldn't, what we would call today compartmentalize and or multitask and take care of family and children or patients. And Julia Richman was really a stellar student, and she wanted to go on to college, but her parents didn't think it was necessary, because she was a girl and girls didn't need education. And there was a battle that ensued between her and her parents. She finally went to the normal college, which was where teachers were trained, which was later, by the way, the first one, the female normal college, which for those of you who are familiar with New York, was later named as Hunter College. And there she organized a young ladies' charitable union, and she became a trustee of that, and it was later absorbed in the Hebrew Free School Association. So she was dedicating her life already to teaching children. And she founded the Young Women's Hebrew Association, which was there to help to absorb this influx of Jews who were coming in from Eastern Europe, moving onto the Lower East Side. And when the numbers began to just explode, she realized the importance of being able to educate and acculturate these East European Jews who came in, many of whom were very impoverished. A number of them were quite illiterate and uneducated, except in the most peripheral kinds, and not peripheral, the fundamental things that you know to live a daily life, maybe how to read, how to do numbers, but nothing beyond that. And certainly she realized the importance of how quickly these Jews from Eastern Europe were going to have to be acclimated and Americanized. And she gathered together with a group of other like-minded individuals, and they joined the Educational Alliance. They established the Educational Alliance, which became for the most important organization for uptown Jews working to Americanize all of these newly arrived downtown brethren from Eastern Europe. She saw the value of teaching English, and she, in fact, deemed that Yiddish could not be spoken in the classes, and that children had to be taught immediately to speak English. And she in her goal to establish, this wide organizational umbrella for all kinds of educational opportunities. In the Educational Alliance, they established kindergartens, and they established cheap, nutritious lunches for children, playgrounds, health examinations, instructions in the domestic sciences for girls, and manual training for boys. She realized that the conditions on the Lower East Side, with bursting classes and dilapidated buildings and the high dropout rates, were a very dismal picture, and that she realized that immigrant children were quickly going to have to be acclimatized. In the process of doing this, she helped to establish these settlement houses, which were there established again for immigrants coming in. They played a significant role again in the Americanization of these increasingly large numbers of Jews who are coming in from all over Eastern Europe. They provided recreation and educational opportunities, medical and social services for immigrants, and they continued to serve all of these people who did not have the financial resources or even the resources in terms of their English to enable children to grow and develop and become full American citizens. Lillian Wald, I'm sure it's another name that some of you would recognize. And she, again, was one of these women who came from a wealthy German Jewish family. And she determined she was going to not marry. She was going to focus all of her energy on public health. She went to nursing school for a very brief period of time. She had even signed, applied to and gotten into what was to become the NYU Medical School. And while she was a practicing nurse, though the story goes, at least in her autobiography, one day she was out on the street and a young girl called her and asked her to come up to look at her mother, who was lying in bed, and her mother was gravely ill. And Lillian Wald went in and saw this woman, and she immediately realized that her work was among the tenements and among the impoverished and the underprivileged, that this was going to be the focus of her work. And she established certainly a name, something that you will understand. She established the Visiting Nurse Service of New York, which is the nation's largest not-for-profit home healthcare organization, and also the Henry Street Settlement, again, one of these settlement houses that offered all manner of educational opportunities, social, domestic opportunities for men and women and children throughout the Lower East Side. And so all of these women were, as I said, they were unmarried, and they dedicated themselves totally to tikkun olam, to improving the lives of those who did not have the ability to give themselves a leg up. Our next group of women don't fall into this category. They nevertheless do fall into the category of women who were very, very focused again on Gemilut Chasadim, a name you will undoubtedly recognize. Hannah Greenbaum Solomon came from a very, very wealthy organizations that were very much part of the lives of well-to-do women. And this was both Jewish and non-Jewish women, but she was invited because of her activity in this club society to head up the Jewish Pavilion, which was really the Jewish Women's. They had the Jewish Women's Committee of the Jewish Pavilion of the Chicago World's Fair, which was enormous. The Jewish Women's Pavilion there featured a tremendous amount of learning from Jewish women in the United States, including Ray Frank, who had sort of served as a rabbi in California, and Rosa Sonnenschein, who had published the first Jewish journal for women, the American Jewess. And Jewish women came from all over the United States to participate in this. It was so exciting, and the participation, the women were so enthused that immediately after this Congress was over in 1893, the delegates founded the National Council of Jewish Women, and they unanimously elected Hannah Greenbaum Solomon as their first president. So the National Council was the first Jewish women's organization in the United States. And you can see that Hannah, even though she was married, she was able to reflect on and address quite vigorously those kinds of comments that were made to women about their participation in the world outside, basically a response to those who said, how can you do this? You go out to work in the world and you're going to abandon your husband and your children. And you can see here these comments: to join an organization of women, not ladies, and one which bore the title club rather than society, was a radical step. And you members, you women out there who are in these organizations, these clubs, these national council chapters that were immediately started to spring up all over the United States, you need to be prepared for the critics to mourn over our neglected children and wonder how on earth our husbands are going to manage without us. So Hannah Greenbaum and the National Council was one of the first organizations that not only looked at how Jewish women should live their lives, they established study chapters so that Jewish women could improve their own knowledge of Jewish tradition, but they also established immigrant services throughout the Chicago area, offering all kinds of aid and assistance to immigrants who came in, both Jewish and non-Jewish. Again, the Tikkun Olam principle writ large, first from their homes into the larger community. The next woman I'm going to talk about is a name that might or might not be recognized to some of you. I'll come back to this Bible quote in a minute, but you can see it's from Micha, that what the Lord requires is for us to act justly and love mercy and walk humbly with our God. Gertrude Weil came from Greensboro, North Carolina. And she's the first Southerner that we see, that we're talking about, who was involved in outside of her home. She didn't marry. She went off actually against her family's wishes to Smith College up north. And then she came back to work in her family's business. But when she came back, she had, looked around and had seen really some of the horrendous conditions, particularly of children working in the mills in North Carolina. And she became actively involved in a number of political social causes. And in this instance, it was much to her peril, because as anti-Semitism was beginning to grow in the United States, women in Jews in general, particularly in the South, wanted to retain a low profile because they didn't want to draw attention to themselves. So for someone like Gertrude Weil to go out and become an active spokesperson about conditions of the working poor, a number of whom were white, but also many of whom were Black. This was something that was not done, and Gertrude Weil, we could look at her very courageous activities as an ardent advocate for both social change and very controversial causes, which included, by the way, women's suffrage, which was not popular in the South. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. A Jewish suffrage women's suffrage in the South was not, and let me just reiterate that, was not embraced by Southern women. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes, as I said. But she stood in the forefront of such issues as suffrage and labor reform and civil rights. And she really did. She worked tirelessly to extend the political and economic and social opportunities for those very, very impoverished people, citizens, and of North Carolina. But she participated also in a number of, and think about this, in the South, of biracial organizations. And she participated, are you all listening, to those of you here in Atlanta, of a conference of Southern white women in Atlanta, which was an anti-lynching conference. And if you can see here, And the very first sentence of their resolutions, where it says they're distressed about the recent upsurge of lynchings and noting that people still condone such crimes on the grounds that they are necessary for protecting womanhood. We, a group of white women representing 8 southern states, desire publicly to repudiate and condemn such defense of lynching and to put ourselves definitely on record as opposed to this crime. Now think about this. This is in 1930, at the height of anti-Semitism in the United States, both in the North and in the South. And Gertrude Weil has contributed, and you can see here that the protocols of this convention, what they talk about is that the lynchings are devastating for everyone, including, and if you look at this photo, and I didn't put this photo in here to disgust you, or to horrify you, but if you look here at the base of the tree, many of the people here that are participating, watching this lynching, are children. And what this conference talks about is how, here it says, it brutalizes the community where it occurs, including the women and the children who frequently witness its orgies, and particularly the youth, who are usually conspicuous participants. And that and the women and Gertrude Weil understood the devastating effect on the moral development of children who both witnessed both Black and white children who witnessed and were devastated, and many of them who were humiliated, and their parents who these crimes were perpetrated against. Emmett Till, as you recall, was only 14 years old. So we're going to move on now to women's participation in the suffrage movement. Now, I don't have a long time to talk about this, but what might seem counterintuitive to you is not all Jewish women, and as I said before, were advocates of suffrage. Suffrage was not popular in the South, for example, because the attitude was that if you are, we don't, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments already gave the vote to Black men. We don't need to add Black women to this. So the racism of the South actually influenced the way in which suffrage was not embraced in the South, both men and women. However, the role of Jewish women in the suffrage movement was not, as I would say, Jewish women, unlike all of the other social movements in the United States, were in the forefront. They were in the vanguard. They were leaders. This was not true in the suffrage, in the suffrage movement. And the principal reason that Jewish women were not in the forefront was because of the very visible, palpable anti-Semitism of the leaders in the suffrage movement. Many of a women's Bible in the late 1890s that was particularly not complimentary to Jewish women and the place of Jews within the normal development of Western religious traditions. I didn't say that very artfully, but the Bible had a negative portrayal of Jewish individuals in Elizabeth Cady Stanton's Bible. That's just an example of the anti-Semitism within the movement. No Jewish women were promoted to positions leadership in the suffrage movement, even though the leaders needed Jewish women to vote. Nevertheless, there were a few women who made their names in suffrage. One of them was Ernestine Rose, who came actually from Poland, and she, as a young woman, 16 years old in Poland, she rebelled against her father, who had made an arranged marriage for her. And she didn't want to marry the man. He was considerably older. She went to a civil court, and she was able to undo the arrangement that her father had made for her. She moved first to London and then came to the United States. And as an ardent abolitionist, as many of the early suffragists were, she was very greatly attracted to the suffrage movement. And she understood that religion, in fact, was one of the principal reasons for women's for men maintaining women's subservience. And she fought against all of these notions of the Bible and religious traditions as enforcing those roles. And you can see here in some of the quotes that she some of her quotes about how she felt about religious tradition, in which she says, superstition keeps women ignorant, dependent, and enslaved. Knowledge will make them free. The churches, and by churches, she's also talking about religious institutions, have been built upon their necks, and it's only by throwing them off that they will be able to stand up in the full majesty of their being. And she spoke and in fact, she became such an ardent suffragist that she became a speechwriter for Susan B. Anthony, and often went with Susan B. Anthony on a number of her speaking engagements. And very often Ernestine Rose was asked also to speak at some of these suffrage meetings. Our next the next woman I want to look at is Maude Nathan, who was unusually, she was not a leader, but she had a very strong voice in the suffrage movement in New York. And in fact, when there was one of the largest suffrage movements, one of the largest suffrage parades in New York City, tens of thousands of people came to the suffrage parade. The New York Tribune actually did a shout out to Maude Nathan, who led a group of women in this vote. But Maude Nathan was, as I said, she was an active social reformer and political activist. She basically lived two lives. She came from a Sephardic family. Her cousin was Justice Benjamin Cardozo, and she was also a cousin of Emma Lazarus. But she worked tirelessly, actually, for women's suffrage, which was an issue that caused a rift in her family, because within her family, they were not supportive of suffrage in general. And I will show you in a minute why, because her sister, Annie Nathan Meyer, who some of you might recognize, was the founder of Barnard College. And Annie Nathan Meyer, as opposed to her sister Maude, who was a very ardent, strident feminist, Annie Nathan Meyer believed that Jewish women could get their work done behind the scenes, quietly, sotto voce, talking and how they got things done, working behind the scenes. But Annie Nathan Meyer was as a successful and as an important social reformer as her sister, but she was absolutely not in favor of suffrage. And she also was afraid that women's suffrage, what they would then be allied with the group of radical socialist rebels who came in from Eastern Europe and wanted to disassociate herself from those members of the labor movements who were marching for suffrage. So even within the Nathan family, there was a rift over whether or not suffrage should be endorsed or not. I can't go into the whole history of why Jewish women were not involved in suffrage, because it sort of takes us a little too far afield. But it was not an even road. It was not a straight trajectory. And there were probably, especially because of the rift between the North and the South, there were as many women or a large number of Jewish women who were anti-suffrage as pro-suffrage. Nevertheless, it became clear that there was going to be a constitutional amendment. It was the only way, because they were not going to get it. They were not going to get states to promote suffrage themselves. Nevertheless, there were a number of Jewish women who were part of the political process of suffrage. Belle Fliegelman Weinstein, for example, came from Montana. Imagine this, a Jewish family. I think her father owned the dry goods store in Montana. And Belle Fliegelman Weinstein became the personal assistant, the legislative assistant to Jeanette Rankin, who was elected to Congress from the state of Montana, not Jewish. She went to Congress from in 1916 to 1917, and now we talk about a profile in courage. Even though the state legislature was opposed to suffrage, when she went to Congress, she voted in Congress, in the House of Representatives, for a constitutional amendment. And she voted yes for a constitutional amendment to be passed by Congress that would make it incumbent upon all states to enfranchise women. She went back to Montana because of this very controversial vote, and she lost the next election. Nevertheless, Belle Fliegelman Weinstein stayed in Washington with Jeanette Rankin. She was her valued assistant. She often went and gave speeches for Jeanette Rankin. She wrote a number of her policy papers. She filled in at committee meetings, at congressional committee meetings, or went with Jeanette Rankin. So she also was and she became a very militant suffragist, and went out to speak on the circuit in Montana and states around it for the passage of suffrage amendments. The next is Felice Cohn, who came, are you ready for this? Carson City, Nevada. Felice Cohn became an attorney. She was only the fourth woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court in the United States. She was the first Jewish woman to argue a case before the Supreme Court in the United States. And when Nevada was going to vote, this was when initially the strategy was early on with women's suffrage, that each state was going to pass a suffrage amendment. When it became clear that this was not going to happen because Southern states were not going to pass suffrage amendments in their state constitutions, it became increasingly clear that the only way that women were going to get the vote was through an amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Nevertheless, Felice Cohn, when Nevada was going to, in the Western states early on, all voted to enfranchise women individually. When it became clear that the state of Nevada was going to pass a suffrage resolution, Felice Cohn was invited to draft that suffrage amendment to the Constitution, which was, of course, ratified in the state constitution. If you can see here, you know, the arguments, I just put this in here because I couldn't resist it when I had found this poster early on. If you look at this poster that came out of Nevada, what women may be and yet not have to, what they may be and not yet have the vote. They can be a mayor, a mother, a nurse, a doctor and teacher, or a factory hand. What a man may have been and yet not lose the vote. He could be a convict, a lunatic, a perpetrator of white slavery, which is a euphemism for prostitution, unfit for servitude, or a drunkard. So in other words, no matter what a woman did, no matter how, you know, she could be angelic and not get the vote, and the man could be the worst of the worst and he would not be denied the vote. So this was, again, part of, you know, the rhetoric that was growing up around suffrage. Very interesting that came out of Nevada. Annie Pulitzer, one of the strategies for the most radical part, the radical wing of the suffrage movement, was the Silent Sentinels. So for 2 years, ladies, count them 2 years, winter, spring, summer, fall, regardless of the elements, in the rain, in the snow, in the sleet, in the hail, in the heat, women went out and picketed the White House for Woodrow Wilson to finally endorse the amendment to the United States Constitution for women to be given the vote. And these Silent Sentinels were women who came from all over the country who went out and picketed Woodrow Wilson, right? You can see right in front of the White House. And one of those who was actually became a very close confidant of Alice Paul, who was one of the leaders of the most radical wing of women's suffrage, was Annie Pulitzer, right here in the middle, who was born in Charleston. So here's a Southern woman who is pro-suffrage, and she not only was a confidant of Annie Paul here, but was one of the Silent Sentinels. And she was, in fact, one of the Silent Sentinels who was arrested and force-fed, as were a number of the Silent Sentinels early on during their picketing. It was a horrendous it was actually torture with these women who were arrested. They went into jail. They went on hunger strikes, and they force-fed them twice a day, forcing tubes down their throats or their noses and pouring a mixture of milk and eggs into their systems. And Annie Paul here said for 55 days, when finally they stopped this torture of these suffragists, when Annie Paul released from jail, they basically had to carry her out. It was absolutely horrific. So we're now going to move on to the real domain of where Jewish women were in the leadership, because they were the ones who were leading the charge. You know, we look, and these are certainly, there are going to number of names and activities that you will all recognize here. But here, again, the infusion, this statement from Jeremiah, woe to him who builds his house without righteousness. And this is going to become part of the value of these people who worked in the labor unions about improving the rights of the workers. And, you know, there are a number of young Jewish women who were in the forefront, and I would say they actually disproportionately, Jewish women from Eastern Europe, disproportionately represented in large numbers in the labor movement. And they were incredibly inspirational. This Rose Schneiderman was a tiny little thing. She was 4'9" with red hair, and she was a fiery speaker. And she talked about the very basic human rights that working women were entitled to. And she talked about, that women need bread, but they also need roses. They need food on the table, but they also need the amenities. And that this was, the basic, more than just a basic living, of a grim subsistence that women had to endure. And they spoke. She was an ardent activist for how the working conditions and the salaries for people, many of whom were very impoverished. They were supporting large numbers of family, had to be improved upon. The creation of the labor unions there to break the backs of these of the factory owners who were paying horrendous wages. The workers were forced to work under terrible working conditions. And so the unions were there to protect the rights of the workers and to improve their lives. Paulie Newman was another one of these really influential labor union leaders. She was the first female appointed to be the general organizer of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGW. Look for the union label here. And she continued to organize strikes to improve the lots of working conditions here. When the rents were rising precipitously in New York, she convened a group of women individuals who went out to a retreat out on the Palisades, and they arranged a rent strike, which was going to help to protect the terrible gouging practices of people who owned these apartment buildings. And Newman actually was actually the great grandmother of rent control in New York. And for those of you who ever lived in New York, you understand what rent control and how that benefited people from having, their rents just rising precipitously year after year. But Pauline Newman herself was devastated by the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire that broke out on March 25th, 1918 in the Ash Building. As many of you know, it was a horrific fire that killed 146 young immigrant women, most of them Jewish and Italian. At the time, there were about 500 women working in the factory. The fire broke out probably on the 10th floor. They think that perhaps someone had been smoking and some of the patterns caught on fire. They discovered that this Ash Building, the Ash Building was just a fire trap to begin with. All of the doors opened in rather than out. So as women herded against the door, they couldn't open the door because the doors opened in. Then when the fire department got there, they discovered that the ladders and hoses could only go up to the 6th floor. Women started coming down the fire escape, and the fire escape collapsed when it got to the 2nd floor under the weight of the women. So a number of women started jumping out of the windows. It was one of the worst trade horrors in New York history. And as a result of that, Paulie Newman and a number of her friends embarked upon all kinds of regulations about fire hazards and improving the conditions in these factories for the workers.
Lisa, excuse me.
Yeah.
We're almost done. We need to start finishing up.
Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. So here are more organizers. I do want to get to some of these important roles that women played in reproductive rights. The Comstock Law of 1873, of course, outlawed the dissemination through mail and passing on of any kind of information, equipment, etc., for the purposes of abortion or contraception. So that was enshrined in law. Here you can see some of these things that women did if they wanted to prevent pregnancy, sitting over boiling onions and hot baths and drinking turpentine. And as you know, Margaret Sanger and Fania Mindell opened up the first birth control clinics in New York so that they could help women with family planning. Bessie Louise Moses and Emma Goldman. Bessie Louise Moses opened the first birth control clinic in Baltimore, which she opened up to both African American and white women at the same time, which was never done in the South. Black women only went to Black midwives. Carole King. Ladies, the age of 17 got pregnant, and she had a choice. She could either abort it, adopt it, or get married. And she married her then husband, Jerry Goffin. And shortly after they got married, they wrote this song that many of you probably danced to at your dances in the 60s, about, you know, what happens at night and will you still love me tomorrow? And that came, and Carole King became a very important advocate for women's reproductive rights. And of course, we get to Betty Friedan and this notion that women have to have more in their lives than vacuum cleaning and making brownies. And that she wrote this very important book that began second wave feminism, commenced the feminist revolution. And then, of course, I'm not going to talk about her, but we all know she's our hero now. But Ruth Bader Ginsburg came out of this, graduated first in her class at Columbia, couldn't get a job because women could not be hired at that point. Henrietta Zold wrote a letter in 1918 to Chaim Peretz, who offered to recite Kaddish for her mother, and she said, "No, I'm sorry. It's important for me to show the community that I'm there to commemorate my mother." Ezrat Nashim, a group of young conservative leaders, presented what they believed was going to be important for Jews in the synagogues, Jewish women, to be given full parity. They attempted to present it to the Rabbinical Assembly at their convention in 1974. They wouldn't allow it, but the Women's League Convention allowed them to come in, where Ezrat Nashim asked that women be given full participation in synagogue rights, and began, as you know, the progress for women in synagogue life. And so we have here, you know, all manner of Regina Jonas, probably the first woman who was a de facto rabbi in Germany, killed in Auschwitz. But Amy Eilberg, first woman out of JTS, Sally Priesand. We have women of all racial types now, racial, social, gender identity. And finally, the last holdout, we have the Women of the Wall. Some of you have been able to participate in these. But it's a long and glorious, very, very difficult history for Jewish women. But I have to say, it was women who did a lot of these things. And thanks to the work of Jewish feminist scholars today, we've been able to rediscover their voices and their activities and their amazing successes. And we can be proud of all of them and participate in singing their praises and participating ourselves in full lives as Jewish women in our synagogues and the world beyond. So thank you.
Thank you very much. We have one question.
Yep.
Could you clarify the death date for Lillian Hellman?
Lillian Hellman?
I mean, I think that was who. Let me look back. Wait a minute.
Emma Lazarus.
Emma Lazarus. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, Emma Lazarus. Let's see. I'd have to let me go back here.
Emma Lazarus, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
she was 34 when she died.
Okay.
So she was very, very young when she died. They think that she died of some form of cancer. It's not clear.
Okay, thank you. That was the only question. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation.
Over. I will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions about the programming, go ahead and put it in the chat. At the end of the programming session, we'll have a question and answer period, and we can go through those questions. Following the programming session and the question and answers, we'll have a break for lunch. We'll have a break, then lunch, and at lunchtime in our breakout rooms, we can continue, and we should continue, our discussion of programming. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Janet Lane, a member of our programming team, who will take it from here.
Thank you, and good morning, everybody. And thank you for sending in all of your inspiring program ideas. There were so many interesting programs. So I am going to go ahead and begin to introduce a speaker from each synagogue congregation. And we're going to follow the order of the program booklet. And so in some cases, the speaker was not available, the program person was not available, so it'll be another person from that congregation. So let me turn it back to Susan Steinberg from Augusta, and she's going to talk about a few of her the program ideas.
I have been, thank you, Janet. I've been asked to talk about 3 of our programs, and the first is our Waze Rebranding. Following the conference in Augusta in 2017, which emphasized journaling and social media as well as rebranding, our sisterhood did discuss rebranding, but we really didn't do anything at that time. In 2018, it was discussed and approved in late 2019, actually after attending our Southern Region Conference in Charleston. And we discussed a couple of other sisterhoods in Southern Region, one of which was Temple Israel in Charlotte, changing their name to Women of Temple Israel, or WOTI, and also Heska Amuna in Knoxville, changing theirs to Heska Amuna Women's League, or HAL. Because our synagogue's initials are AYS, we had a number of choices. We had Babes of AYS. Nope to that. We had J's, Jewesses of AYS. Nope to that. Lays, Ladies of AYS, but that's potato chips too, so that was out of the question. And Mays could be Maidens of AYS or Mavens of AYS. We said no to that as well. One other consideration was Sisters of AYS or SAYS, which doesn't rhyme. And we finally came up with Ways. So as president at the time, I sent out different font choices and also came up with the idea of using the women's restroom sign for our A. And that's what we ended up with, and you can see it backwards. Stuff gets backwards on Zoom, but you get the idea. The second program I was asked to talk about is Joint Sisterhood, and I'm not sure how long we've been doing it. I think maybe 25 to 30 years. The sisterhoods of our Reform congregation and our congregation host a joint sisterhood meeting every other year. Last year was the Reform congregation's turn. This year it was ours, and it was kind of challenging. And in the past, we've usually done dinners or luncheons, and we've kind of switched to luncheons the last few years. But this year we had to come up with something virtual. And I'm on Presnet, and we came up, someone mentioned Jukebox Bingo, showed their flyer and everything. So we discussed it and we decided this would be a lot of fun. And this is the flyer that we used, and the people really enjoyed it. And we also were able to give gift cards to, we had, I believe, 5 winners. And we might choose to do it again. It was a lot of fun. Rosh Hodesh, this is a group that we started a few years ago. And at first we were just our own sisterhood group, just AYS. But then we decided to let other Jewish women join. And we now have a mix of conservative, reform, and Chabad. At first, the group started meeting in people's houses at approximately 7 in the evening. And food was discussed in association with the specific Hebrew month. The group also discussed chapter by chapter the book, The Happiness Prayer by Evan Moffat, and we also started discussing strong women in the Torah. This year we had to go virtual as of April last year, and the women are really enjoying that because a number of our women don't want to drive at night. We also have a program called Coffee Connection where we meet informally one Sunday a month. And the flyer, the first is our a flyer that we sent out. And then the second one you see is where the month that we combined it. And the first one is a postcard. It was a live meeting. And we felt like we could not use postcards for the Zoom because the Zoom link would be out in the open. But so we started sending out flyers, and this particular flyer discussed what was going on in March and April. And that is it.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Our next speaker is Irene Kramer from Montgomery, Alabama, and she's going to talk about her painting party.
Hello, everyone. I'm Irene Kramer, and I'm currently serving as Sisterhood Treasurer, but I'm representing the Sisterhood of Agudath Israel Etz Chaim. I was just thinking about how we would rebrand AIEA, which would be a challenge, but we could take it on. Anyway, we had like I said, the blurb here in the program says that we had a very engaging paint party as one of our openers when we were still in person. And we had a luncheon. We had a high school teacher come from one of the high schools, and she brought all the supplies that we needed. And of course, we gave her a fee for that. And we collected at the door for contributing to that fee and the supplies and the luncheon. And we had invited the Reform Synagogue to join us, the Reform Sisterhood to join us. And we basically she taught us one line at a time how to do painting. And it was a very basic painting. It was a 5x7 piece of artboard. And it was, I think the thing that surprised us all is how much fun we had. It wasn't one of those things that, is going to move mountains or change society, except for our laughter. Our laughter was just an incredible part of the event. It was, we talked to each other, we intermingled, and it was very fun to see how compare. We were all drawing the same picture. It was interesting to see how many versions of the same thing we had, but it was very, it was just one of those light things that we did. That was one of those things that I still have my picture. My daughter was with me at the time. She still has her picture, and we just had a great time with just getting to know one another and having some fun learning how to paint. And it was definitely worth the time and energy that was put into it. So that's our project.
Thank you, Irene. And the connections that you make with each other are, invaluable. So next up is Michelle Gunsman from Bethel Temple in West Hartford, Connecticut. And she's going to talk about two of her programs, America's Jewish Women, and then making a Hallmark movie. So, okay, Michelle.
Hello, everyone. The first program that I'm going to share with you falls into the category of what I would call opportunistic use of local talent. During this long winter that we all just survived, we learned that one of our congregation members is a screenwriter for the Hallmark Channel. And not being a Hallmark movie buff myself, but well aware of what they're all about, I thought that a program on this topic might be the perfect midwinter antidote to all of the unpleasant news and events occurring at the time. The screenwriter, Julie Sherman Wolfe, gladly agreed to do an informal interview with our synagogue president, who happened to be a closet Hallmark fan, which focused on a couple of her recent movies. We advertised it as an insider's look at creating a Hallmark movie and an escape from reality into a world of joy, hope, predictability, and happy endings. The lighthearted interview covered her educational background and career path, the specifics of doing the job, key characteristics necessary to succeed, and where the ideas come from. And we always like to have some kind of Jewish component to our programs, so we had a very interesting discussion about how Judaism informs her work and why most Christmas movies are written by Jews. Same is true for most famous Christmas songs.
Mm-hmm.
It was also interesting to hear about how many of her movies were aired each year, in her case, 3 per year, and the challenges of making movies during the pandemic, and also the changes in the industry and at Hallmark in recent years. We showed some short clips of 2 of her current movies, which were showing at the time, as well as an example of an actual script, and allowed 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions from the audience. There were some very funny behind-the-scenes stories, and everyone had smiles on their faces throughout. It was just what we really needed in February. The movie that was in current showings at the time in particular was called Taking a Shot at Love. It was aired a few times before our first, or between our first advertisement and the day of the program, so we could tell people to watch it. But if they didn't have a chance to see it before the program, it was also shown a couple times after, so this was just pure coincidence and worked out beautifully that people could actually see the movie before or after. And what made it even more fun is that the movie's setting, not where it was actually filmed, which is Canada, but the setting was called Avon, Connecticut, which is a suburb of Hartford, right next door to West Hartford, and where Joey actually lives. So she was able to use some local references where possible. For example, using the Hartford Wolfpack hockey team logos and referring to them. So those local references and the hockey storyline ensured that the several men in our audience also enjoyed themselves. We invited the entire congregation, men and women, as well as other local synagogues, and there was no charge for anyone. Our speaker didn't charge a fee, and we sent her a dozen chocolate-dipped Sherry's berries as a token of our appreciation. Now, while this exact program may not be easily replicated in other communities, it's possible that one of your own congregation members has a background, career, or hobby that others would find to be as fascinating as we found this to be. And he or she just might be willing to share some insider information with the members of your organization. The second program I'm sharing with you today is something that any group could easily replicate, and it's a great example of a plug-and-play program in that there's very little preparation that you would need to do. Professor Pamela Nadel of American University in Washington, D.C. discussed her 2019 book with us called America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, which won the National Jewish Book Award, Jewish Book of the Year. Her very engaging presentation style and ability to make history truly come alive as she shared fascinating details from her book made her the perfect person to help us celebrate Women's History Month this past March. Professor Nadel has impeccable credentials. She's the chair of Women's and Gender History at American University and is a recipient of their highest faculty award, Scholar Teacher of the Year. Her other books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, from 1889 to 1985. She's a past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and has received the American Jewish Historical Society's Lee Max Friedman Award for distinguished service to the profession. Her book looks at the question, what does it mean to be a Jewish woman in America? Weaving together stories from the colonial era's matriarch Grace Nathan and her great-granddaughter, who we heard about earlier this morning, poet Emma Lazarus, to union organizer Bessie Hillman and the great Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She shows two threads binding the nation's Jewish women.
Excuse me, Michelle. There's
Yes.
some really bad background noise coming from your presentation. I'm not sure what it is.
I'm sorry, I will move my iPad and my iPhone further
Oh,
away.
okay. Thank you.
Does that help? Because there's no noise in the house here, but hopefully that helps. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, the two threads that bind the nation's Jewish women are a strong sense of self and a resolute commitment to making the world a better place. Professor Nadel is a real pro, and as I said, there'd be very little effort that you would have to put forth to ensure a successful program. She has done presentations about this book to many sisterhoods, maybe some of you have heard her speak before, and other organizations, but it really still sounds fresh when she delivers it, and she even modifies her talk slightly for reform versus conservative audiences. She showed many pictures that enhance the stories as she led us through her highlights of 300 years of history in 40 to 45 minutes. Again, we had a 10 to 15 minute Q&A session at the end. And again, we had invited the entire congregation as well as other local synagogues, and there's no charge for anyone. She's a pleasure to work with and has a very reasonable honorarium.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. That was interesting. And next up will be Sue Margolis from Beth Shalom B'nai Israel from Manchester, Connecticut. And she's going to speak about the program from commemorating Yom Yerushalayim, and then the presentation of the rabbinical student from Germany. Okay, and you are muted, Sue, so make sure you're muted.
Hi, I'm Sue Margolis. As you mentioned, I'm here to talk about they were both Torah Fund programs. The first one was back in May 2020. We called it Commemorating Yom Yerushalayim, the reunification of Jerusalem 53 years ago. Jerusalem of gold, Yerushalayim shel zahav. So as you can imagine, there's a lot here. So first, because this was all virtual, the program began with a very spirited video hosted by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav hashalom, called Jerusalem, the Beating Heart of Faith, which I recommend you watch. We then segued into historical and very moving footage showing the IDF liberation of the old city. But the heart of the program was called Recollections. It was a recollections piece during which we shared stories about when and where we were before, during, and after the Six-Day War. We ended with singing O Devo Shalom Aleinu with Moshe Ben Ari at the Mikudeshet Festival in the Old City of Jerusalem. The second program was more recent. It was on April 13th, and our virtual Torah Fund event spotlighted the Zacharias Frankel College in Potsdam, Germany. Now, my mother's family is from Germany, so that kind of kickstarted the idea for that. We began with a short video with snapshots of Potsdam and short descriptions of the current student body who come from countries around the world, such as England, Argentina, the US, and Spain. Our guest speakers were Sandra Anisavich Bear, the school's CEO, and Karen Engel, a current rabbinical student who plans to graduate in 2022. Sandra first described her journey from being raised in Dresden, educated in Jewish studies and Islamic studies, and writing a dissertation centered on the Jewish high school in Berlin, among many other accomplishments. Karen, the current student, originally from LA, described her childhood and how she was influenced by her family, consisting of Polish, German immigrants. She moved to Europe in the 1990s to work as a radio journalist, covering Jewish issues. She was also very involved in the small Jewish community in Austria, and she raised her family there. This experience motivated her to advance her Jewish education, and she chose the Zacharias Frankel College for its focus on rabbinical text and Talmud. Both women also detailed the religious and secular Jewish community in Potsdam and Berlin, and the various challenges and opportunities presently and for the future. This Zoom event allowed us to connect in person with two very vibrant and dedicated women who gave us a firsthand look into the Jewish community in Germany today. Despite the late hour for them, they graciously welcomed our questions, and we left the session feeling more knowledgeable and inspired.
Okay, thank you so much. That sounds really interesting too. Next is Jane Silver from B'nai Tikva in Canton, Massachusetts. And she's going to talk about the Sister Zoom program about Jews from many lands and how you connect people connected with their traveling.
Hi. So I'd like to, if possible, share my screen so I can show you a few of our flyers. Not sure if I can. I guess not. But we have done several programs this year. We decided to do a monthly program for the ability to bring everyone together. We had many of our congregants and our sisterhood members have traveled widely. So we've asked some of them who had done so to do a presentation on where they had gone and the Jews that lived there as a monthly program. And the first one was New Zealand, where we learned about the Jews of New Zealand and how they live and where they came from. The next one we did was Cuba, and we had a number of members of our temple travel to Cuba. Our temple, it was combined with another, there were two temples that combined about 3-4 years ago, and a few years prior to that, members of one of the congregations had gone to Cuba. So they had gone on a women's trip learning about the Jews in Cuba, and we had a fabulous presentation on that. And we had a member who had been to India, and she had traveled all over the country to see the synagogues, and we had a wonderful presentation on that. The other sister Zoom program that we have done was an antiques roadshow style program where we learned about history of our Hanukkot, and we have one woman who had an amazing collection of Hanukkot, and she showed hers and we showed ours, and everybody shared those together. And then afterwards, we did another program for the Passover, and we all showed off our Pesach Seder plates and why they were meaningful to us and our family history of them and so forth. So those were we tried to do a monthly program, and that one went out pretty well. Our first program on Zoom was last year's donor dinner, where we had dinners delivered from a local kosher store who it's a market, but they made dinners, and we had individual dinners delivered, and we had paint supplies delivered, and we did a painting program together on Zoom, which was kind of fun, and repeat that this year for our donor dinner. We actually did very well with that program, but it self-led, so we just sort of followed the guidelines in the kit that we each got, and we each did our own. But the one that we'll be doing this year will be done with a professional painter who will guide us through the brush strokes on a full canvas instead of a small wooden board that we. Our educational director is an amazing cook, chef. So we have done so many cooking programs. We've made Rosh Hashanah, we made strudel, we made babki, we've made salads and chocolate barks for Tu B'Shvat. We've made, we just made for our sister Zoom trip to Israel, we made and hummus, and we've had a lot of fun with that. Our big program this fall, we do an annual program called Sisterhood Celebrates, and this year our celebration was surrounding our love for history in Yiddish. That's when we always name our Woman of Distinction at that program. We had an amazing turnout, and we invited the word mavens, and they are two women from, I believe, Pennsylvania, who entertained us with their Yiddish funny jokes and stories, and that was our most well-attended program this year. So most women are not a big fan of Sister Zoom, of Zoom in general in our sisterhood, but we're getting more and more each time. So hopefully by the time we get to go back, they'll be comfortable with Zoom and we can do it a combo. So that's where we have been and where we're going. Okay, thank you so much. Next up is going to be Jody Castle and myself from Beth Shalom right here in Atlanta. And Jody's going to talk to you about our vodka and latkes program, and then I'll be talking to you about our Shabbat at Home program. Okay, Jody.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Well, this was a really well-attended program. We had the program on a Saturday night, and everyone could bring a spouse or a friend. So it was very open to everybody. Nobody felt like it was just couples and they wouldn't feel welcome there. We had people bring their mahjong sets, their poker, their Scrabble. We also had extra games, cards, etc. And I thought dinner was great. We had a Havdalah service first that the rabbi conducted. And then we had kosher deli sandwiches, pastrami, turkey, corned beef, We had vegetarian sandwiches with hummus and roasted peppers, etc. Lots of vodka, cranberry juice, orange juice, etc. That was a huge hit. And I thought our tables looked pretty nice. We had the napkins folded like dreidels since it was Hanukkah. We had, of course, applesauce and fruit platters, etc. And people could play a game, or some people just came and schmoozed all evening. And we had many, many requests to do this game night again. And as soon as we can meet face to face, we'll have another pressing, schmoozing, and chickering game night that will be planned. So this was fun. And now I'll turn this back to Janet because we do programming together. And she'll tell you about another great program that we have at Congregation Beth Shalom in Atlanta. Thank you.
So we decided to do we decided to do a Shabbat at Home Together program during this time of COVID and not being able to be together to pray. And so we started back in August of 2020. And I want to tell you how our program has evolved. We've held it each month. We picked the first Friday of each month so we'd have that consistency and people would know and come to expect it. We decided, Jody and I decided when we first started that we were going to just reach out to the general sisterhood membership and just try to get people involved this way and try to get them to attend this Zoom Shabbat service. And honestly, after about 2 months, that was not a successful way to go ahead and try to do this. We spent hours and hours and hours on the phone, making calls. And interestingly, you know, some people would say no, they didn't feel comfortable. And these were all English readings, except we also did Kiddush, and we were doing, we lit candles together, but we're asking people to read English reading. So we started to use a free program that I would highly recommend, and that's Sign Up Genius. And with Sign Up Genius, you can send out for free a sign up, and people that want to participate can participate in. You can choose how many English readings you want, who's going to, you know, you can have a slot for Kiddush, a slot for lighting the candles. So that was such a better way to go about trying to get people involved. And, you know, we've had people that really enjoy and say, we so look forward to doing that. We then began thinking that we were going to do just 10, we chose random passages that were all about Judaism. They were spiritual, they were great, they were interesting, but there were too many passages, and the passages, people would read through these 10 passages, and they were all great, but there was no theme about it, and it was just, people weren't getting anything out of it. You know, we were trying to have people connect, and that really didn't happen because it was just read the passages, and then we go right into our rabbi starts Friday night services. So we started about 6, and services started 6:30. So we picked a central theme, and we were still doing too many. So let me just fast forward to where we are today. Where we are today is we pick a central theme, 3 passages. 3 is enough. If you want to do 4, you could probably do 4 passages. We select questions, and we used Google Docs, where people, the link can go out instead of using a Microsoft Word. If you use Google Docs, you can, if there's a change, you can change it, and people will get that information. I have a flyer that we've created, and it's the same flyer each month with a link from Google Docs embedded with the readings, the 3 readings, the questions that we're going to discuss. We also have a member of our synagogue, and Penny Schwager is here, and her husband Ken plays the clarinet. So we began, now that the time has changed back at about 5 to 6, he will play songs, and it's a really, really nice, touch that we're hearing, these Jewish songs and Shabbat songs. And then we go into lighting candles together. And if people want to unmute, we all come together. It's not always a pretty sound because with, Zoom, not everybody's always in sync, but we do that. We have the readings, we have the Kiddush together. And we've really enjoyed, I think, we've enjoyed this. And I foresee that even after the pandemic is over, we may, if the synagogue wants to continue this this Shabbat at home together with sisterhood, that we will continue that. And so that's what we did. All right, and so next up, I want to introduce Stacia Barry from Orange, Connecticut. And Stacia is going to be speaking about Kick Your Clutter. Okay, and you're muted, Stacia. Good.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stacia Barry, and I am from Congregation Or Shalom in Orange, Connecticut. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about, we had a paid up membership Zoom event with a speaker, Lauren Haas, and she is a Kick Your Clutter expert. And she gave us she really just talked about what it means to have clutter in your house and the stress that it could bring and sort of how to get out from under that stress and little things that you could do to prioritize your space or make yourself feel better about your home environment. And it was attended by about 35 of our sisterhood members. It was really well received. People really enjoyed the program, asked a lot of questions, and it was our only event for the year. And we hope to do a combination now that things are being a little more relaxed and we can have in-person events, do a little combination of Zoom events as well as some in-person events. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacia. Next is going to be our sister Atlanta Synagogue, Congregation Etz Chaim, and Melissa Sklar is going to be talking to you about cocktails and collage.
Great. Thank you so much, Janet. Thank you so much, Janet. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our local sisters at Beth Shalom and the entire conference management team for putting on such a meaningful event today. We're just so thrilled to be able to connect even virtually. I'd like to also mention, as Jane and Michelle pointed out, what we ended up doing is using the idea of tapping the gifts of your own congregation to use within your programming. And Jane and Michelle pointed this out so well in their program summaries. So for our fall membership appreciation event, our paid up event, which was held this past November, we had contacted one of our congregants who happens to be a very established collage artist. And we had actually spoken with her a year before and had this planned on the calendar a year before, as we tend to do with our calendaring. So she was going to do a full demonstration on how to make an artistic collage, provide all the materials. And we decided, call it Cocktails and Collage, and we'll offer up a fall themed cocktail and a fall themed mocktail. Well, of course, COVID happened, so we ended up doing a quick pivot and went virtual and decided to do this entire program on Zoom. So we ended up compiling all of the collage supplies, all of the art supplies into separate bags for our registrants. We did a quick pickup. They drove up and picked up at the Shoal. And in that bag of full instructions and materials and paintbrushes and rulers and glue and scrapbooking material, we had a recipe for a fall themed cocktail and a recipe for a fall themed mocktail, whatever their choice was. they could create this at home. And we had a Zoom event, much like we're doing today, with our artist highlighted who demonstrated the step-by-step in making a personal collage with your own photograph or whatever materials, plus additional materials we provided. We had an incredible turnout. Everyone enjoyed the process, showing their designs as they went, posting them later on our Sisterhood and Synagogue Facebook, social media, so it was shared throughout. We also found that we garnered some additional new memberships through this event alone because people wanted to be a part of the event so badly that they joined Sisterhood so that they could be included in this paid up event. So it was very successful even as a virtual event. I'd like to also quickly mention, as Susan mentioned in her presentation, we also did the Jukebox bingo event. And we did this in January after the holidays, kind of a low point in a lot of people's experiences after the holidays. We combined with our men's club and did a joint co-ed jukebox bingo with couples or whoever wanted to join, had a huge attendance, really fun event. So Susan, you reminded me of that when you mentioned that. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Melissa. And we did a bingo as well, and we did Yiddish bingo. So that was a fun event also. Fern Cohn from Emmanuel Synagogue in West Hartford is going to talk about two interesting programs, one on homelessness and one on Jewish genealogy that you guys had. So go ahead and take it away, Fern.
Thank you, Janet. I'd like to compliment everyone involved in making this day so wonderful. There's so much out there for us, and I hope we're all taking advantage of it. First, before I begin, I'd like to say that our synagogue has had an extremely successful year with virtual programming. The pandemic didn't stop us, and I'd like to throw out some thanks to our programming vice presidents, Debbie Melman and Audrey Anufsky, as well as the Sisterhood Board, who are responsible for our success. And I'd like to also say we've had great participation in all of our programs. So I'd like to start with a genealogical program. And the speaker was Barney Miller. And our vice president went to a program that he presented at. And so he graciously consented to come and speak with us. We had 30 people. We had it at 3 p.m. And he gave us information on how to search for some of our ancestors. And for me, it's around the corner, but there's a synagogue that houses all of the library for the Genealogical Society of Connecticut, and that's at Temple Sinai. And as a member, you can borrow items from the collection of books, periodicals, and audio and visual resources. And it was, we said for an hour he would speak. He went way over. There was so much information that I would like to hear him again and dig a little bit deeper. So that was one program. And the other one was by a word of mouth to our vice president. And one thing that we realized is not everyone starts out homeless. And the speaker that we had was homeless, but he started with a good job. He was making lots of money, and he invested in a bad situation, and that took everything off of him. And So he came to speak to us, and it really was a very valuable program. Let's see. Oh, we also, they asked for socks and things, but we encouraged a donation, and this way they could get what they needed. We did this in combination with Bia Denu, another group, and one thing we tried to do is partner with other groups, Adult Ed, Brotherhood, so this program, it's called handsonhartford.org. Jeff Luxembourg is the program manager, and if you speak with him, it's a nonprofit agency, and it helps the homeless with housing, food insecurity, health concerns. And it was a very moving program. So those are two of the ones that we have done this year. Thank you.
Thanks, Fern. And I'm already thinking we could probably in any city find that same sort of organization and connect with that homeless organization to get a speaker. Next up for our horticulturists is Sue Lishkoff from Temple Beth El in Birmingham. And she's going to talk about Houseplants 101 and what's a bonsai.
Thank you. First, let me say I'm not a horticulturist. I do not have a green thumb. However, I did learn a lot from these programs, which I'll share with you. But to begin, let me just say that our goal this year, as I'm sure it has been for everybody else, is to keep our sisterhood connection going with our sisters. And without being able to see each other in person. So we've really done this successfully. We've had a lot of Zoom programs that have been well attended. It's interesting though how the ideas for our programs have come up. We don't have a program chair. We operate with a steering committee, which consists of myself and Arlene Fisher, who we are co-presidents, and then 5 or 6 active, devoted, dedicated sisterhood members and our treasurer. So we try to get ideas from the group so that they will help us carry out the program itself rather than us trying to come up with it. So at one of our recent meetings, the idea was brought up by one of our steering committee members to do a program on plants. And because she had just bought a plant that she loved from a local shop. And then somebody else in the meeting at the very same time said, well, we could also do bonsais because we have a member in our synagogue whose hobby is to raise bonsais. So that's how these two programs came up. And I'll just talk briefly about each one. The program on plants was given by a local small plant shop owner. And it was moderated by one of our women on our steering committee who had purchased a plant from her. The program began by explaining where to locate your plants. What type of lighting does each plant need? Does it direct? Does it indirect? Is it low light? Which, I don't know about you guys, but I always just put my plants wherever in the house I wanted to put them. But she drew out pictures of a room and showed us exactly where the light was coming in so we could identify what she was talking about. And then she went along and showed us different plants and what type of lighting they needed in order to really flourish. And of course, then she talked about, a lot of questions came up about fertilizing and transplanting and, just different things that we might have questions about. And there were a lot of questions. People were very, very engaged in this. And my daughter actually just told me that indoor plants is back in again. They're a trend. So we were right on target, apparently, with that. The second program was about bonsais. And I've always been fascinated with bonsais. I've never had one. The presenter was a member of our congregation who selects and raises bonsais as a hobby. And the moderator for this was also a member of our steering committee. So we were trying to keep everybody engaged. It was quite a learning experience, I think, for all of us. The first thing we learned is that a bonsai is not a type of plant. It is actually a way of shaping and training a plant to grow. So the speaker showed us many different examples of plants and cuttings that he has actually nurtured and grown that are shaped in a variety of ways that are considered bonsais. So it was quite fascinating, I think, to all of us. And again, there were a lot of questions, a lot of engagement. And he's now offered for any members of our sisterhood who wants to come to his home and see his collection and talk about how he's done this to come to his home. So that might be an idea when we'll be able to be in person again, is to have a follow-up and actually go to his home and see these live and in person. So both programs were well attended. We got a lot of positive feedback. There was actually a request to do one on orchids. So apparently our members are into plants and growing things. And right now we haven't yet found somebody to do one on orchids, but we're still looking and hopefully we'll find one. So I hope this has given you some ideas for some new programming, and I appreciate the opportunity to share with everybody.
Thanks, Sue. Next, Cheryl Lerner from Temple, Israel, in Natick, Massachusetts, is going to talk about Purim, the Purim story from the women's perspective.
Thank you. Thank you. So my co-chair, Sue Schofield, has been absolutely fantastic when I come up with these ideas of trying to bring me back to reality. I pulled in a lot of information about Purim. Thankfully, I just came upon a magazine that I had stored away that had an article talking about how a group of women decided to look at the Purim story from a feminist lens, and putting what I was researching together with this, came up with the idea of presenting some various topics about the Purim story for to break out into sessions, into rooms on Zoom, and look at each person would have a different topic, and they would then study it, discuss it, and rewrite it in a new medium, such as a courtroom, a TV courtroom scene, or a coffee group at some outdoor restaurant, or a talk show on TV. And I just told everybody, have fun with it. This was a year into Zooming, so I didn't think it was appropriate to get into really heavy study. Although what I found in pulling up all the commentaries and midrashim about the Purim story, that it really was interesting to see, not just from a feminine lens, but from an adult perspective, because everything I knew about Purim was from what was told to us in Hebrew school. And obviously Purim isn't a story that's covered on Shabbat because it's not in the Bible. So this was also very interesting. Some of the midrashim got to be a little bit bizarre, so I left those out. But we happened on 5 topics, like the role of Haman's wife rather than Haman. Esther what was her real relationship to Mordecai, and various things. So what we did, we sent out this little 2-page story as a teaser for people to read. And then I found 5 women who were willing to lead the session. So I presented the materials to them first so that they could drive the discussions at the when we did the breakout sessions. We didn't feel it was good to send everybody this material in advance, because if they didn't read it, they might not show up. So we wanted everyone to feel that they could come and learn right at the meeting. People got really silly. It was fun. Perhaps if it was in person, we could have gone into more serious study. But I think that for this time of year and for what people were doing on Zoom at this point, it was fine. Everyone had a good time. Someone grabbed a scarf and put it over her head, and it was really cute. I do want to point out that my email address on the program is a little wrong. The first two letters are interposed, so it's CS Learner. Happy to send you all the background material if it will help if you want to run the session.
Okay, thanks, Cheryl. Finally, Harriet Weinstein. Harriet Weinstein is going to be speaking about her sisterhood Tea-less Tea, and she is from Peabody, Massachusetts. Temple near to Mead.
I'm Harriet Feinstein and am honored to represent Temple near Tamid Sisterhood alongside all of you amazing ladies with your wonderful programs. I've been a member of my very active sisterhood for many years, and we've always had monthly meetings with the exception of July and August, and found that the month of February to have poor attendance or in many cases having to call off the meeting altogether due to a snowstorm. We came up with the idea of having a non-event event by sending a letter in the form of a poem inviting our members to a tea-less tea. Included was an individually wrapped kosher tea bag asking you to sit back, relax, and have a cup of tea on us. Over the years, it evolved into a fundraiser asking for donations for a specific cause that's important to us and to our community. Last year, we had 5 congregants that had some form of transplant at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston. We wanted our congregants to know that we care and wanted to give back to Brigham and Women's. We chose to have the donations go towards helping families while their loved ones were in the hospital. And the funds could go to many things towards parking, hotels, food, or any need that the family might have. And this past year, we sent the following poem, as we do send poems for each of these years, written by member Beth Hoffman, not only to our sisterhood members, but this was the first year we included the whole congregation. And I'm going to read you the poem. It's cold outside and snowflakes are in the air. Stay inside and have a cup of tea in your favorite cozy chair. Sisterhood's Tea-less Tea is to raise money for those in need. It's always a mitzvah to do a good deed. The cause we have chosen has touched our TNT community. Let us all help them with a show of unity. Send a check, big or small, to show your appreciation. Brigham and Women's organ transplant will thank us for our donation. Give for someone who may need a heart, kidney, or lung. You could be saving the life of someone older or young. We chose, every year we put a pre-addressed envelope in with the poem, so people will already have the envelope and the person to send back their donation. And I'm happy to report that we did raise for this one time $1,800. And some of the charities in the past that we've donated to were Shasheret, the Jewish Breast Cancer Awareness Organization, Shriners Hospital Transportation Fund, Kayla's Club to support those with Down syndrome, Haven from Hunger, Family Promise, the Israel Relief Fire Relief Fund, and a backpack program, No Child Goes Hungry. And this is where this particular program puts weekend food into the backpacks for those that wouldn't be able to have a lunch on their own. And donations have ranged from $700 to $1,250, with a jump this year, as I mentioned, to $1,800. As you know, the secular month of February comes in as the Hebrew month of Shabbat and goes out as Adar. When Adar arrives, your joy increases. Our joy certainly increases by doing this mitzvah, and we hope the joy increases for those receiving the much needed donations. Thank you.
Thanks, Harriet. So this concludes the inspiring program ideas that we are sharing. Time is 12:30, and I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl.
Okay, we have one question in chat today, and it is from Ruth Leibovitz, and her question is the program on genealogy mentioned by Fern Cohen recorded and available to watch? So Fern, if you are...
Sorry, we didn't record it.
Well, okay, somebody's interested. If you do it again, or if he has a recording, you might be able to share that with other
If they send me their email, I will connect.
Okay, Ruth, you got that. Send your email to Fern Cohen. She should be in your program, and you can connect with her. You can put, yeah, that would be the best way, and she will get you the information you need. All right. That was the only question about a program. I found it fascinating, the variety of programming and the creativity that people have used during this COVID time to connect and keep our sisterhoods together. Thank you, Janet, today for representing our Congregation Beth Shalom programming team and all of you women who shared with us your great ideas. We're going to go to break right now, and then we will reconvene, if you have your schedule in front of you, at 12:45 with your lunch, and we will be in breakout rooms continuing discussion of other programs that we might want to share during that time. You can bring your questions as well then. So thank you, everybody.
Back, and welcome to our North Atlantic Region Southern Conference, Biyahad. I have the pleasure of introducing my friend Victoria Budson, who is currently the Global Head of Diversity and Equity and Inclusion and a Senior Vice President with Bain Capital. Victoria spent many years at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and has worked with very talented women all over the world. And I'm sure you'd much rather hear from Victoria. So Victoria, thank you so much for joining us today, and you're on.
Wonderful. Esther, thank you so much. It is a pleasure to be with you always, but particularly this morning with terrific women from all over the country and our two regions. So I wanted to talk with you this morning about how there are so many ways that we can get involved, and each and every one of you has many skills. And I know you regularly volunteer and are in other types of volunteer roles. And I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about running for office and how one can contribute one's skills, not just volunteering, but in elected or appointed office. And there are so many positions in your own community, within your state, and nationally. And many of these opportunities you can do without traveling. There's lots of federal appointments that one doesn't need to sort of leave one's geographic region. And I know that most women start by saying, I don't want to do that. I just want to keep volunteering the way I always have. But you have a lot of knowledge and a lot of ways that you can impact the world, and this can give you additional capacity to do so. So I'm going to talk with you about that, and I'm going to leave plenty of time for us to have a conversation. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to look at Esther in a minute, who will nod to me to let me know if people can see my slides. Excellent. And I have two screens, so you're going to see me look to the right. So getting involved is easier than you think. And I want to talk about why it's so important. And if you're from a community that has a town meeting or a local council, or if you have regional areas of your community. And the first thing when one thinks about doing so is just really understanding, how do you demystify the process? What are the types of opportunities available? And how do I locate them? And how do I figure out if I have the skills for it? And I can guarantee you, each and every one of you who is zoomed in today has the skills to make a significant contribution in your community. And after you've done that, thinking about what are the skills that you have, networking, which I know that everyone on this phone knows how to do and does well, and then having fun. People often think about getting involved in anything that has a title as performance, and I encourage you to think of it much more as experience, what you have to share and what you would like to learn. Now, most people, when they think about participating in more formal roles, they ask themselves a number of questions, and women usually start with, do I know enough? Am I good enough? What would happen if I ran for town meeting or town council or city council and I lost? And those are all very reasonable questions, but I like to say that they're not the right question. The right question is, what will be lost from my not having participated? And people put a lot of boundaries in front of the ways that they can impact their community that are really just choices. And I'm going to talk with you today using some examples of women that I've worked with from all different parts of the globe. As Esther shared, I led something at the Kennedy School called the Women in Public Policy Program. And about 15 years ago, I created something called From Harvard Square to the Oval Office. Many of you will live in communities where there's an active League of Women Voters. And in addition to sharing the issues, they might teach women how to run for office. And that's what I did with women, not just from my own community, but from all corners of the world. And women tend to run for office when they're thinking about solving a problem, when they want to authentically change something in their community, and as a way of thinking about or measuring success. How can they give back and contribute? And I know that each of you is active in ways of thinking about how you can contribute within the Jewish community or other communities. And most women sort of set aside the idea of running for office as somehow quite different than those, but it's more similar than it is different. And I just wanted to share, these are the countries of the alumni that I've worked with, and where you see the pink, those are areas where the women I've trained have been elected in different parts of the globe. And even though each community is different, the skills and the core set of what you need to learn and understand is the same. And the work I've done has been replicated in many different areas around the globe. So the training sites have now been replicated. So every place that you see one of the pins is a place where they've replicated, and there's women being trained there now. And when people think about office, some of you may be the person who likes to be on the committee, and you help discuss, and you deliberate, and you think about, and you negotiate. And if you're really great at committee work, then you may be interested in being part of a deliberative body. So if you can be on a committee and figure out what's going to take place at the ONEG, or you can be in a committee and understand what you think the order should be for a ceremony where something's being dedicated, you have the skills to think about running for any type of office. And deliberative bodies tend to be legislatures or city councils. And for some of you, you'll be familiar with this. You like being the head of the group. You like to say what's going to happen, and you bring people together to figure out execution, but you like making those choices. And I can see some of you nodding that is the way you like to function. And if that's your propensity, you might really enjoy executive leadership. If there's a town manager, or I live in New England and we still have town meetings, and there tends to be a moderator, and the moderator is the person who is in charge of all of the process, the proceedings, and what takes place. People who like executive leadership enjoy roles like that. You might also think about running for governor or a position like that, which is also an executive branch role. And this is Fadumo Daib. This is a snapshot of an image of her from the New York Times. She's one of the students that I trained who's from Somalia. And she was the first woman ever to run for the presidency of Somalia. And in her country, women were not considered to be appropriate candidates for public office or anything to do in public life. But she felt it was important to break down that barrier. So as you would expect, she didn't win for the presidency, but by being in that race, She shattered a glass ceiling, which is now forever broken, and that barrier is no longer present. And she changed the way people view women in her society. And I like to open with that to say, if Fidumo can do this, I promise you that you can consider it in your own town or community. This is Amélie de Montchalin, and she's a member of parliament in France. And she ran right after she graduated, very young, certainly didn't have the breadth of knowledge and wisdom and experience that you have. But again, an example of someone who wanted to be in a deliberative body, whereas Fidumo was interested in being in the top spot, in that executive level leadership. This is Alexandra Dublanche, and she did both. She was vice president of the Paris region in charge of economic development, but she also was deputy mayor of Sartrouville. So she enjoyed both having a deliberative role and an executive role. I'm someone, for example, I enjoy both. Colloquially, I say I'm partial son. There are some of you who might fully like being in the front of what's taking place, and some of you who might fully like being in the background of making good things happen. I think I'm like a lot of people, that I'm okay in either spot as long as I feel I'm making a contribution. And Michelle Wu, she was on the Boston City Council and president of that body. And she's someone who first joined a deliberative body and then was elected to the presidency of that. So she had both experiences. Now, when people think about running for office, they usually think about what it would be like to have to be in public and debate someone, who would be running for town meeting that I'm also running for. And when everyone sort of closes their eyes and envisions that opponent, people have a pattern where you envision your opponent being bestowed with whatever attributes you think you don't have. So if you don't like public speaking, you envision your opponent as the best public speaker. If you have been in the home and not had a job outside the home, you envision oneself running against a person who's had a long career in business or other public realms. And in reality, you usually run against someone who is not bestowed with all the attributes that you worry about your opponent having. And I can tell you that your opponent will be equally concerned about what it would be like to have to vie for a position with you. But you should remember that your opponent is nothing in particular. Anyone in the United States can choose to run for an office once they're of a certain age and registered. It doesn't mean that they have particular skills. And we literally have a citizen government. So each and every one of us not only has the opportunity, but in my view, has the obligation to contribute in ways that we choose, whether elected or otherwise. And I wanted to just frame this out a little bit for you to think about where we reside within the United States compared to the rest of the world. So when we think about the Nordic countries, they have about 44% women elected in their parliaments. The Americas, including North and South, is about 30%. Europe, almost 30% overall, a little less when you take out the Nordic countries. Sub-Saharan Africa, 24%, Asia 20%, Middle East and North Africa region, the MENA region, about 17%, the Pacific region, about 16%. Now, when I began this work on building women's equality, Sub-Saharan Africa on down in the chart hovered around 0. So the amount of global progress we made is very significant. Now, when you look around the world at the top 10 countries for women's parliamentary representation, and really thinking of this all over the world, and when one does global comparisons, one compares what's called the lower house, which is our Congress. So you can think of who's in our House of Representatives, and you'll see that the US is not in the top 10. And in fact, we are tied for 76th and 77th. We are way down low and continue to fall. Other nations have made incredible progress with women's equality. The way I was saying that these used to be 0, the US has not. We have just edged up a little bit. And part of what we need to do is to have individuals throughout the country who have experience, who aren't career political leaders, but who feel like they have value to add to think about participating. And when we think of people running for office, sometimes we imagine that equality of women's political participation will take place if countries just become developed or if they become democratized. But what we find is that it's not a linear progression. Democracy doesn't ensure women's equality. Development of nations that are still building infrastructure and gaining traction in their economy doesn't necessarily open pathways to women. But what does most is institutional reforms, enabling structures so that women are guaranteed seats, that we don't have any type of quota system here in the United States. At the federal level, we do have it in both major political parties for their state committees, and often you'll find gender balanced slates on Democratic or Republican city and town committees across the country. So we actually have some structural interventions. We just don't think of it and sort of attach to that fact because of our American rugged individualism. There's some really great, if you're interested in learning more about that, there's some wonderful work by a woman named Pippa Norris. You can just Google gender quotas and you'll have more information than you could read in several days. And one of the reasons that it matters to have women in elected office is because decision-making bodies that have a diversity of individuals on them, they make better decisions. We also know that women tend to accurately assess risk. Men tend to think of, and this is across the whole bell curve, tend to think of unlikely yet positive events as more likely than they are. And women tend to think of positive events as being a little less likely than they are, but we're closer to the actuality of what may take place. So having gender balanced decision-making teams for issues which are complex or important yields a lot of productive action for the community. Now, we also know that here in the United States, that women prioritize spending on education, healthcare, and the environment meaning sustainability. You can think of clean air, clean water, renewable resources. And sometimes decisions are made with really grave unintended consequences. For example, here in the United States, when Social Security was created, there were very few women in Congress. And nobody meant to create a law and a system and an administration which treated women and men differently. But they forgot that women live longer than their male peers, that they're more likely to have taken time out of a career to take care of children and elders and other family members. They forgot that women make less money and that overall women's jobs are less pensionable. And all of those factors combined have made it so that the largest group of poor people in the United States is elderly white women. And then the majority of women who are poor and were not so during their working years didn't realize that they would be poor as they aged. And so sometimes just having people at the table who can share life experience can dramatically impact whether our legislation has unintended and grave consequences. Now, if you look at this pie, this gold orange color, and then this tiny pink slice of all the people who've served in Congress since 1789, of course, in 1776, our country was founded. Our political structures, the way you see them today, were codified in 1989. And between that time and today, less than 3% of the people to have served are women. So it's so important that we both encourage, participate, and vote for women to make sure we don't end up with additional unintended consequences like the Social Security example. We have even many fewer women of color who've been elected, and this gives you a snapshot of women of color who've recently served. And that's an important area of experience, which we also want to make sure is reflected and represented. And here's just a few notable firsts to give inspiration, that just because something hasn't taken place before doesn't mean you can't get that done in politics. Almost everyone that I've trained to run was a first. Hilda Zacharias, first woman on the City Council in Santa Maria, California. Stephanie Carter, first African-American Republican woman to be elected to the Texas House of Representatives. Never take because something hasn't happened as a barrier. See it as an invitation. And I then wanted to share this dynamite picture of the 116th Congress, where we had more diversity than we've had in a long time. And it helps you just see and understand how much we can accomplish and do and make difference. I'm going to pause here and let you look for your state. And what you'll see is this is the percent of female legislators. Some states have a professionalized legislature that meets full time and is highly paid. Most state legislatures, people do part-time. Sometimes they're all volunteer and they meet just a few months out of the year. Sometimes they're quasi-professional, which means people might have another job, but many, many, many women choose to run after they've retired when they have the time, they have less caregiving responsibilities, and they know a lot. You know about your communities, you know the things that have gone smoothly, you know what the challenges are, and they enjoy being a state representative or a state senator or a member of Congress or serving on their local school board or serving on their town council or within their town meeting. And I encourage you to think about when you envision volunteering, your name on a ballot. And I also wanted to say that there are many different places. If you are here in both coasts and somewhat throughout the South, there's a group called Emerge. They help women who are interested in running for office learn how to do so. And you're usually in a small group of about 12 and people have a ball. Their win rate's incredibly high. The League of Women Voters is another. And then all of these others are available to you. And in this time period of COVID, it's an easy way to take some lessons for interest or to share with friends. I always say definitely ask your friends to think about running as well. And when you run, really great things can come from that. It builds your name recognition. So sometimes people say, I don't know if I can win, but I want to make sure people can hear the important ideas I have on the environment or on recycling or on the schools. It's a nice way to build your network and meet wonderful new people. It lays the groundwork for future campaigns, and you can impact issues that you care about. And I'm going to also say the US, we lag behind because of incumbency. 99% of incumbents win. Because of the structure of our system, we don't have the type of systems that are parliamentary based in Europe, where you might have slates. We're what's called the first past the post system, where for most of our electoral practices, you just need one more vote than the other person to win. And I don't know why my screen just flipped for us, but there we are. And I'm going to turn off my screen share. And I'd now like to just talk with you a little bit about appointment processes within your area. Most states, if you Google appointments and the name of your state, it will bring you to an appointments page, and it will talk with you about all the different ways that you can identify appointments. So here in Massachusetts, if I went to appointments.gov or Googled that, what I would find, I'm interested in gender equality. So we have a Commission on the Status of Women and Girls, and I could learn how to get appointed. And for example, that committee, there's appointments by the governor, appointments by the Speaker of the House, appointments by the Senate President, and appointments by the Caucus of Women Legislature, the Caucus of Women Legislators, that's open to anyone can apply. And I'll tell you a story. Many years ago, I applied in the open process, maybe 20 years ago, and a lovely woman named Bev Droz, who had been the head of the Massachusetts Women's Political Caucus, called and said, Victoria, we wanted you to know you had a great application, but you just, missed the round of people who got appointed. And maybe almost 2 decades later, I was then appointed by Deval Patrick. And then when his administration ended, I was appointed by our Speaker of the House. And there's a lot of different ways to participate. I was recommended when Deval Patrick had his team reached out to me, and had a friend not suggested me, had someone else in the community not suggested, I wouldn't have applied again. Because like most people, I thought, oh, I tried it, it didn't work, and I moved on to something else. But you should really think about who are the great women you know, who would be dynamite, just the way you've seen them in action on all types of committees, including your work with this organization, who would be incredible serving on a local or state or federal agency. I know some of you are interested in the arts. The National Endowment for the Arts has people who sit on that from across the country. Many organizations federally have regional posts. Many of these posts go unfilled. I worked with the Obama administration's White House Council on Women and Girls, as well as the Presidential Personnel Office for the Obama-Biden White House on how to hire and create more diverse teams. And I can tell you that it takes all 4 years and would take longer to fill every appointment that's out there. So there's more opportunity than you think. People always imagine there's a high bar. And with that, I'm going to pause, and I'm happy to take questions both on what we've talked about today, issues regarding women and gender equality more broadly, and appointment processes or electoral processes. You're welcome to ask me anything you like. And with that, I'll pause. And Esta, I didn't know if you or someone else would like to moderate the Q&A.
No, I'm moderating for you. So Vicki Eisman has asked, would ranked choice voting help women get elected?
Oh, it's such a good question. So ranked choice voting has been introduced as a concept from one of our congresspeople from Northern Virginia. He used to be the ambassador to Switzerland, and his wife served on my board. And I have been hearing about the ranked choice vote proposal for a long time. So the information that we have, the research we have on ranked choice voting, is it can really open up processes. And for those of you who aren't familiar with it, ranked choice voting means rather than what we have now, like let's imagine that Esta and a woman that I don't know, that let's just call Susie Brown, were both running for office. I would say, I know Esta, I know she's a hard worker and she's smart, I'm voting for Esta. And I give her my vote. And after I've given my vote, it's done. But now let's say that there's Esta and Susie Brown, and there were 4 other down ballot candidates that I didn't really pay attention to, who are also running for this office. And I know that Esta's my first choice. But if other people didn't choose Esta, foolishly, that maybe Susie Brown would be my second choice. But there were 2 or 3 other people that I felt very strongly did not share my foreign policy goals or perspective. And I did not want to see them in Congress. So I give my first vote to Esta. I give my second vote to Susie Brown. And I give no votes to the other 2, which means that rather than a polarized system where you can end up with a person that most people didn't, that wasn't really, we can often end up in a system where the vote gets split. You hear people talk about splitting the vote, where let's say that Esta gets 20% and the next candidate gets 21%. And then there's kind of a candidate that none of us, that was more polarized. And even though overall, if everyone said, could you live with this one as opposed to this, no one would have gone with kind of the fringe candidate. But because the vote was split, they end up winning because the liberal vote or the conservative vote was split across other candidates. Ranked choice voting prevents that. It means that reasonable people get to put down sort of a chit on several candidates that they could live with, so you don't end up with a candidate that most people don't want. Now, would it help women? It's hard for us to know for sure if it would help women. I think that ranked choice voting overall would, and I will tell you why. We don't have a research study that shows this per se, but whenever people are in a position where they are looking for individuals, particularly for executive leadership, whether that's being the CEO of a company, whether that's being president of the United States, we tend to return to our stereotypes. We're pretty comfortable as a society to elect women to deliberative bodies, and we're still much less comfortable doing so to executive leadership. So I think ranked choice voting would absolutely help women in things like the presidency and gubernatorial elections, and it may also help women for other types of races for Congress or deliberative bodies, but I think it could make a real difference at the gubernatorial or executive level. And we just had that discussion in my own town of whether I was in favor of ranked choice voting and at our state level. And my thought is, it's worth giving a try to new structures as long as, we can pilot programs and see how it turns out. Sometimes you get a candidate that people refer to as a bit milquetoast because everyone found them palatable and, they weren't people's first choice, but they were their second choice.
Okay, thank you, Victoria. Does anybody else have any questions? I don't see any hands raised, and I don't have anything in the chat. So it appears, Victoria, that maybe everyone in this call wants to consider running for office. And
Can I
certainly,
ask if there's anyone on the call who has?
I have a question. I have two questions. So Victoria, do you want to repeat that and then I'll ask the questions?
I was going to ask if there's anyone on the call who's run for office.
My daughter ran for office.
How'd it go?
It was very interesting. She was running for Jacksonville City Council against a, quote, appointed candidate. It was very fascinating. She lost by about 211 votes.
Well, let me ask, through the process, was it different than you and she had anticipated?
Well, I didn't anticipate anything. Actually, Sunny's a Kennedy School graduate, so she may have taken your course. I don't know.
How wonderful. Yeah, we have, it's real nice. I bump into women regularly, or I'll get emails and they'll be like, I'm running. I was in the class 14 years ago. It's my moment. And actually the first woman to ever run after the class was someone who at the beginning said, I'm definitely not going to run. She was an accountant. She's a lovely Jewish woman. She usually is at my table for Shabbat on many a Friday evening with her husband and kids. And then a seat opened up and she ran. Now, is your daughter going to consider running again? Because that's a very close race.
It was funny. She was running as a Democrat in a very Republican area. So she was supposed to lose by 40%, but she didn't. I mean, it was a third, 30, the split was bad because of the way the district has been gerrymandered, but it wasn't 2 hours later, but the Democratic Party called and said, are you running again?
Well, what's funny is people imagine that things are impossible. And what I've learned from a career in politics and policy is everything is possible. I mean, truly everything is possible. And now more so than ever, because you can reach a broad group of people with less money and sort of lower touch interventions, when before you literally had to mail, and mail costs money, and you can pull people together on Zoom and in other formats just incredibly easily.
So I didn't mean to interrupt this person who was going to ask you a question, but I do have a question after that.
Well, why don't you do it right now, Barbara?
Okay, so you talked about when you were talking about the things that kept women from running, and you were saying about the sort of what's going on. I think for most, I mean, sort of what was the word you used? It was like, it was one of your very first slides.
Demystifying the rules, or
yeah,
women tend to say, am I good enough? Can I win? What will people think?
Yes, and then it talked about the things that were barriers. And, when the numbers that you show, the few percentage that have women running, it's very unusual. I mean, you have to go against that sort of tide. The question is, how does a woman, I'm a physician and a public health doctor, so I'm aware of how I get people together to support things for public health, because it's about their health, and I go to the schools and I go to the churches. But I'm just sort of wondering, how do you go against those things? I live in the South, and I'm not running, but how do you get other people to consider to run against those, what just seems to be unbeatable odds?
So a few different things. So the first thing is, we've seen again and again, particularly sort of in the last decade, that people win against the conventional wisdom. It's becoming pretty commonplace. And each of you, just the way you talked about the organizing you do in public health. And by the way, I can just note, we've never needed physicians and people who understand public health more. And it's a great example of how when we don't have that skill represented, it can be incredibly complex for our communities to react. So the best way to do is to really ask. There's a number of different studies that show women need to be asked multiple times. And even though I teach this stuff, my knee-jerk reactions have been the same. I've been elected and appointed to things. And when I was on the Commission of the Status of Women and Girls, I was leaving a meeting and a woman said to me, Victoria, you should really be chair. You should run for chair. And I said, oh, that's so nice. Kind of don't be silly. And I went home and I thought, oh my gosh, I just did that thing that I literally train women to not do. I literally did it myself, like knee jerk. Oh, isn't that nice? But I'm not going to consider it for myself. And I thought, you know what? You should show up and you should respect other people's views. So the first thing to do is to ask women several times. Some studies, the studies show different numbers, but conventional wisdom is you need to ask women about 5 to 7 times. Now, compared to our male counterparts, men often wake up in the morning, they think, I don't know how this country has worked without me running for office. And they kind of self-appoint. And there's nothing wrong with that. I wish more women would wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to run for office today. But women usually need to be asked. Women usually run because there's a true problem they want to solve. Very few women, I wish women ran from sheer ambition, but more women run because there's something that they just wanted to fix. Barbara Roberts was one, I think she was the first woman governor of Oregon, and she had a special needs child. And she went from level to level to level to level, just trying to get the resources she needed for her child. And the journey eventually led her to be governor. So talking with women about what they can actually change is a core motivator. Women also tend to run on behalf of others. Like Esta, we really need you to be in this leadership role. We need someone who can run the organization well. So women often do things out of duty. They feel that it's the right thing to do, so they'll step up to leadership and do it. And it would be great if women just said, I want to be at the front of the room, but very few women do.
Okay, thank you. Marilyn Lieberman has a question.
Yeah, Lieberman.
Lieberman, I'm
okay.
sorry.
I first want to make a statement that my granddaughter works for Bain in Dallas.
Oh, how wonderful.
Very impressed with the public service they do. Is wonderful. What you haven't talked about is my sister-in-law's sister ran for governor of Missouri several years ago. And money was a big issue. Mm-hmm. And of course, she also was a Democrat and there was a Republican governor. And you haven't talked about money because Emily's List said at that time, if they had known what a good candidate she would have been, they would have poured more money into her election than they did, and she lost. And I think she lost mainly because of finances. So what is your take on that?
Yeah, Marilyn, that is a great topic and a great question. You've mentioned Emily's List, which is one of my favorite organizations. It stands for Early Money is Like Yeast. It makes the dough rise. Meaning if you support a woman candidate early on with money, it helps build momentum. Here in the United States, because of the media market costs, there's no congressional district you can run in the United States without needing to invest more than $1 million, even in a small market like Rhode Island. And a market like California, we're talking just extraordinary dollars. And each year we're seeing the cost of being competitive in a House or Senate or gubernatorial race, depending on your media market, it goes up and it can be quite large. Now, there are organizations like Emily's List, and I will note I worked for Emily's List years ago, helping to raise funds. And what Emily's List does is pretty unique. So some of you may be on this call today and feel like you don't want to run, but you want to support other women candidates. Wish List is the Republican counterpart to Emily's List, and both of them provide dollars to support women who want to run for office. There are many, many places. Oh my goodness. And I'm seeing from Barbara Levin that Sunny Gettinger's her daughter. And yes, I trained Sunny. So 3 points for Sunny. I'm giving her a heart. When one is doing running for office, you absolutely need to have those individuals who are going to support you. Now, each of you could make a list. And when I work with candidates, I talk with them about, first, you write down everybody who's like close to you, your family, your dear friends. Then you go out to the next ring. What are the committees, organizations, things I've been involved with, schools that I've attended, places my children have gone, my knitting club, my crocheting club, my book club, my temple community, my, I sat on a committee 10 years ago and we rebuilt the library at the local Montessori school, whatever it may be. And the first thing you do is you go to every single person you know and you ask them to give you a reasonable amount. Reasonable for them and reasonable for the race. And after you've made the ask, like if I was asking Esther if I was running, I'd say, Esther, I know you and I share many of the same values. We care about the Jewish community. We care about Israel. We care about women being healthy. We care about all kinds of rights. I wanted to ask you to support my candidacy with a gift of $200. And then I take a sip of water and I say nothing. Nothing raises money better than making the ask and then you get real quiet and you wait for the other person to fill in. And it often sounds like, gee, I'm not that political, Victoria. Thanks so much for calling. Let me think about that. I'd like to talk to my husband, but I guess we could do something. These are important issues. I think that's brave that you're doing that. I think I'll send you the $200. And if you feel that dead air, that space that's uncomfortable, and you say, oh, don't worry about it. Why don't you go think about it? You're much less likely to get the check. So what one needs to do is to kind of make that ask. And after you've gone to everyone that you now have a baseline. And you have enough money that you can begin to get on the radar of more major organizations like Annalise Lister Wish List. People are in a position now to raise money better than ever before because you can crowdsource it. You can put a video up, it can go viral, you can have all of your friends tweet, you can post about it on Facebook. You're all part of different networks and lists, and as long as it's appropriate for the group, you can send it out to that list, and all of those different actions can break down those barriers. Now, I'm going to tell you something that may surprise you. When women run, they win as frequently as their male opponents do. The challenge is that fewer women run. So there's this kind of myth that women are less likely to win. We're not. We're less likely to run. And the women who get elected tend to have higher credentials. I look forward to when mediocre women get elected all over America. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But what we find is that women tend to be pretty darn exceptional because there's still higher barriers, right? Women have higher social sanction for failure. Women tend to be judged, whether that's in our homes, in our communities, or across our state or throughout the country. So there's a lot of different hurdles that women need to get over, but the biggest one tends to be inside us. It tends to be that we think running for office is really for somebody else. But I promise you, it isn't. Our communities and our states and our nation stronger for our participation.
Fabulous. I would give you more than $200. Judy Meyer, you're up next.
Hi, I'm just curious what got you started on this in the first place. Do you have some childhood, long, deep-seated motivation or story behind that? Or did this just evolve slowly? How did you get into this?
Yeah, that is such a great question. And I'll tell you, so, and given the audience, I will tell you very candidly. So I grew up in a suburb in Massachusetts. I grew up in Wellesley Hills. I've always been very connected to my Jewish community. I grew up in a Reform synagogue. I lived in DC for a while, and I went to Orthodox shul there, and am really sort of comfortable in whatever sort of style of Judaism, whichever part of the Jewish movement one is in. And I went to Sunday school and later taught Sunday school. And one of my Sunday school teachers was a man named Lenny Zakem. He was a Brandeis student. And Lenny Zakem told us a story in Sunday school one day. He said, there's a man named Joe, and Joe has a job, but his job doesn't pay him quite enough money for him to have all the money that he needs. So Joe also is on food stamps, which is the language that was used at that time. Now, it's really important that people eat nutritious food, and we want to make sure that people are healthy. And he says to our small class, there are 13 Jewish kids out of 330 in my graduating class from my high school, to give you a sense of it. And he says to our small class, do you think Joe should be able to get a Hershey bar, or should people only be able to spend that money from the government on healthy food? And like, we're little kids, and we're all like, oh, he should have to get healthy food. And then Lenny says, well, what if he looks forward to that Hershey bar all week? What if that's that one pleasure that he has in his life? Should the government be able to decide whether he can have that? And we all paused and reflected. And so I had that kind of percolating in my mind. And it was very clear to me from a young age. My dad was a doctor and my mom was a teacher. And I grew up in Wellesley's an upper middle class suburb of Boston. And most homes that I was in, my own or others, women took a break from work at some point to raise kids, and or their husband's job was considered the primary. And it was really clear to me that things in houses weren't equal. And it was also clear to me that there were winners and losers in that lack of equality. And it also seemed arbitrary to me. And I thought, and when I was little, it was not the way it is today, where kids say whatever they think. If one said their opinion, people would say, well, you don't make the rules. Right. I remember thinking, add to my bucket list, make the rules. Because I didn't think it was fair. I wanted it to be different. And I was active in my youth group. I went to college. I had the great fortune of going to Wellesley College, where women ran everything. I had never been to an institution that was better run, and it was extraordinary to see. I had never been someplace where there was a woman college president and a woman the head of each and every piece of it. And that was instructive for me. And I also, I was born without a small piece of vertebrae. And at some point that caught up with me, where I ended up on bed rest for the better part of a year. And we didn't know if I was going to be able to sit down or hold a normal job or have children. And when I went into that bed on bed rest, I had attended marches in Washington, but I wasn't a front of the room person. I wasn't someone who wanted to run things. I tried to contribute, but not being kind of the instigator, so to speak. But I had a lot of time to think. And I needed major spinal surgery. I had a spinal fusion back in the early 90s, when medicine isn't quite as robust as it is today. And what I understood was that if I was going to be given the gift of giving my life back, of getting that back, what did I want to do with that life? To paraphrase Mark Piercy, what was I going to do with this one precious life? And I decided if I ever got out of that bed, I wasn't going to waste a day. And I have moved forward on building equality with zero concern for what other people think about that. Joyfully, every day is a gift. I work equally happily with people who would stand shoulder to shoulder to build equity, and equally happy with people who think women have no place. Because every time someone tells me no, They give me information on how to get up, over, around, or through. And I've had the privilege of working with the Obama-Biden administration on executive orders to create equal pay and to change fairness, to working with a coalition of 40 organizations to pass the Massachusetts Pay Equity Bill, which was replicated in many states and cities across the country and filed federally, to work and advise governments all over the world. And people sometimes say, don't you get tired or depressed? And honestly, I never do. I go to services on Friday night, we sing, the week closes, I break bread, and as Esther knows, eat way too much challah. My kids, it's too good. We've been baking it. I finally learned to do the 5 braid, and then we started over again. I don't work Saturday for the not by rule. I'm not Shomer Shabbos, but I take Saturday off, and I start again on Sunday, refreshed to keep going. And I will say, my very thoughtful, kind Jewish parents had no idea what my career was in the early stages. They're like, "What are you going to do with your life?" And I said, "I'm going to lead social movements." And there's a very long pause. And then my father eventually said, "Are you going to go to business school or law school?" They were like, "What are you talking about?" And none of us at that time were educated enough to know that there was a Kennedy School of Government or things like that. But that's really why I do the work that I do. I mean, for me, it really is, it's my way of participating in Tikkun Olam. It's something that I feel like I have the capacity to do. I was never interested in politics per se, but once I understood that political leaders who are just people like you and me, right? That's all. They literally make the rules, and they make choices every day that impact everything from the most public to the most private decisions we will ever have to make. And I am absolutely 100% sure if we don't have women and others who have different perspectives around that table, we're not going to get it right. And there will be grave consequence for that.
Wow.
Wow.
Heavy.
Victoria, I don't believe there are any more questions. You were absolutely phenomenal, but I knew that coming into this. And when I presented you as our other keynote speaker to our committee, we have a question. I'm going to pause and go ahead, Robin Metzger, unmute yourself.
Esther, I wasn't raising my hand. I was applauding Victoria. Beautiful.
Thank you, Robin.
Dr. Esther, I have a question, sort of, if you don't mind, for Victoria. I had the privilege of working with Lenny Zackheim probably close to 30 years ago. Absolutely remarkable individual. He came to Minnesota to help with a political issue. And I know that he has since passed away, but his son, I believe, was very active or became active in Boston politics. Could you make a comment about him and whether he's supported by other women?
Sure. And thank you so much. And is that artist who just asked the question?
Yeah.
Very nice to meet you. Well, I'll tell you, I had the great privilege of my first paid job being with Lenny Zakem and Sally Greenberg at the Anti-Defamation League here in Boston. For those of you who don't know Lenny Zakem, he was an extraordinary leader within the Jewish community that worked on the civil rights of all individuals, but with a particular focus, of course, with ADL's focus. So it was my first paid job in 1989. And on my first day, Sally Greenberg took me to a gender bias in the courts study press conference. And a judge, and a clerk, and a lawyer all stood up and said, yes, women encounter bias at every stage within the judicial process. And then everybody had a Danish and a cup of coffee and went back to their offices. And I thought, my goodness, they've just said women don't have equal justice in the United States, in the court system. And everyone just was like, okay. And I thought to myself, that seems like an enormous problem. And that was part of my journey. Lenny created a brand of leadership within ADL that no one could work with him and not admire, and created social justice initiatives like Project Harmony and a World of Difference campaign, which I was lucky enough to, work on in the smallest of ways in the beginning of my career. And apple does not fall far from tree. So Lenny's son has been an incredible political leader here in Boston. I think he has, I don't follow his races in particular, except from the sidelines. People speak very well of what he has been able to accomplish and do. And I also applaud, it must have taken a certain kind of strength to follow in the footsteps of someone who was as productive and impactful as Lenny. It's not always easy, right? To try on your own after having a parent or a mentor who's as skilled as that, but a really incredible family, incredible group of people. And may Lenny of blessed memory, stay in all of our hearts and minds and continue to guide our actions and belief in what is possible.
So we actually do have, we had a comment from Dr. Stern when you asked, was anyone involved in local politics? And she commented that she was an elected town meeting member on the finance team. And Shirley Morrison has a question. Is there an age limit for government jobs? And then we have another question from Corey Schneider.
Yeah, I don't think there's any age limit for government jobs in the United States. Over 40 is a protected class in the United States and one cannot discriminate against, whereas being 39 and under, one is not protected. So I do not believe that there is any limit for that. And as we saw, a fair amount of discussion around that in the last presidential electoral cycle. And it's interesting how age comes into play. I think it's very important that we have leaders who have experience. And rather than having leaders who've never made a mistake, I would wish for my leaders to have made errors and mistakes, both in judgment and in practice, and to have learned from them. Rather than someone who hasn't risked or engaged, which is really the only type of person you're going to find who has no track record of ever making an error, because we have very serious issues to solve today, whether it's the healthcare crisis like COVID, the economic ramifications, the foreign policy challenges, the incredible need for the continuation of understanding of how we move science forward. I mean, there's really, there's no issue that we are solving that doesn't have complexities to it. Right. So I say here to people who are older, and as also we've had a rise in the need of two incomes in a family. Much of the unpaid labor that women historically have done, applying all of their talent and expertise and skills to community organizations as well as political organizations and operations, that labor that is in that unpaid space has declined as the needs for families to earn more income to acquire or attain sort of minimal living standards means that we have less people who can sort of do that work, which is why people who are retired also can play a larger role and frankly are needed to play a larger role than even in the past.
Hey, Corey, if you'd like to unmute.
I think I am.
You are.
Okay. Actually, that was my question. Not age consideration and age discrimination. There are many of us who are older and in number anyway. And I wanted you to comment on it, which you really did with Shirley's question.
Well, Corey, I have another great comment on that for you then. I think it was in something like 1992, definitely before 1996, somewhere in that range. I was on Talk of the Nation with Nancy Pelosi. And I think it was a President's Day episode. And we were talking about how there'd never been a female president. And Nancy Pelosi on Talk of the Nation on National Public Radio basically was like, well, I'm too old to consider that. Because at that time, you know, perhaps, you know, she and others might have considered that to be the case. Now, of course, she went on to have this spectacular, right, career being front and center, and though not president of the United States, without any doubt, in a significant a leadership role. And so this notion of age and what it means to be too old, one is ever changing, and people, where we used to think of women as having their third stage, meaning that career that you get to have after you've finished raising your family and taken care of everybody else, that you might get a shot at doing some of the things which you find for pure impact and pure joy. But we really now even have a fourth stage, right? We are living longer than ever before. We have higher levels of capacity than ever before. We have better sort of swim lanes of good health than ever before. So I would really open yourself up to any way that you might be interested in contributing. Many years ago, I was active with the League of Women Voters, and I volunteered to be the observer to the selectmen for a year. So for a year, I went to every meeting, I read all the materials, and I dutifully reported back. Now, at my age, I look back and think, how ridiculous. If I was going to go to every meeting and read every material, I should have run. I should have seen if I could participate, but it didn't even occur to me. And I think that there are many of us who follow the issues, who are educated on the issues, who have experience in the community, who participate and contribute, but don't actualize that opportunity to actually make the decisions or take the votes. And I would encourage you to consider crossing that threshold at any age. And frankly, you're more equipped now than before, for sure.
Victoria, thank you so much. Yasha Kohak, you did a phenomenal job, and you are talking to a lot of leaders within our Women's League International organization, and maybe the wheels are spinning for a lot of other women.
Hope so. I sure hope so, because if you are anything like my friend Esta, I can guarantee you that you would be a high contributor in any body, executive or deliberative, that you're part of. And Esta, thank you for inviting me and including me today. I've so enjoyed my discussion with each and every one of you. If any of you think of questions or want to communicate after, Esta has my personal email, and you're welcome to do so. So be well,
and
stay
thank
healthy.
you so much, Victoria. You exceeded everything that I thought you would do.
Thank you, Esta.
Thank you. Okay, ladies, we are up for a break. And then we will split. Susan, do you want to talk?
We have Minka next.
Oh, sorry. Thank you, G. You're 100%
we have Minka
correct.
and then a break.
We have Minka, but we do have a break. No, we don't.
We don't.
Okay, I was wishing that I had a break. But we're going to dub it. Yes.
This is your break.
Got it wrong. Sorry, ladies.
Before we start the Mincha service, I'm Marcia Fish, and I want to thank members of Beth Shalom Sisterhood in Atlanta for participating. I want to first call upon Cheryl Garfinkel, a member of our management team, to give us an opening prayer.
Hello.
Cheryl?
How can we change the world? Change the way that things are. What will it take? Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay.
All-day conference.
What have we done so far?
I'm on an all-day conference.
Are we calling for kindness? Are we leaving a legacy we will be proud of forever? Do we care about others? Do we try to understand? Could we unite the globe? Every place, every land. So what are we doing? Will it ever be done? Can we create a better future for the generations to come? Can we nurture all spirits between the ocean and the sky? Can we change the world? We certainly can try.
Thank you, Cheryl. Jews are bidden to pray 3 times daily to God. The Shacharit prayer takes place in the morning. It is the longest of the 3 daily prayers and contains within it the basic affirmation of Judaism, the Shema, the Amidah, and the ideas of repentance. The Ma'ariv prayer takes place at night, after sunset. It's much shorter in length than Shacharit, but nevertheless includes again Within it, the basic Shema and Amida prayers. The shortest prayer service of the day takes place in the afternoon, or at least just before sunset, and is called Mincha. It is composed of the recitation of Psalm 145, the Amida, a prayer of repentance, and the concluding prayer to all Jewish prayer service, Aleinu. Mincha is usually a 10 to 15-minute prayer service, but for much of the Jewish world, it has become almost a forgotten prayer service. It's not the length of Mincha that has caused this, but rather its inconvenience in coming in the middle of a busy working afternoon. But in that fact alone lies perhaps its major importance and necessity. Our sages attribute the origin of our 3 daily prayer services to our patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Abraham created the prayer time for Shacharit, Isaac for Mincha, and Jacob for Ma'ariv. The rabbis of the Talmud deduced the role of Isaac in creating Mincha from the verse in the Torah that tells us that Isaac went out to the field to converse in the field. The Torah itself is silent on the subject. The rabbis are of the opinion that the conversation was between Isaac and God. And since the Torah describes this event as happening before evening, Jewish tradition placed the time of Mincha as being in the afternoon. Mincha is also connected with being in the field. Shacharit and Ma'ariv are possible to be prayed outside of the time constraints of our mundane everyday tasks.